So this is the first substantive session of the Ethics and Governance in AI class that we're doing together with Media Lab and the Berkman Center are doing together, and I'm co-teaching it with Professor Jonathan Zittrain, who will be speaking after me. So I thought I'd start out by talking a bit about why we're doing this class, what I hope you think about as we go through this class, and maybe touching on and framing some of the things that we'd like to work on together. And as we said at dinner yesterday, this is such a new field that by the end of this class, you will know more than 99.99% of people who think about this thing. And just like any new field, and I think Jonathan and I are old enough to have been in that period of the internet where there literally were only a handful of people who knew enough about each part of the internet to help get it started. And it really is like that. I mean, I think that AI broadly is a fairly large space with lots of people working on it. But this field of AI and governance, AI and ethics, I wouldn't say it's just this room, but it's a small enough number of people thinking about it in a smart way that it really is an opportunity to contribute. So I hope that this will kickstart some of you to make this, if not your main thing, at least a peripheral thing that you're interested in. I want to start with this image, and this comes from Lawrence Lessig's 1999 book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. And this was a really important book because this is the first book where he sort of describes the relationship between code and law. And we argue about whether we call this Lessigonian or Lessigian, but the idea is that either the behavior of an individual or the behavior of society or the future of civilization is somehow governed by 4 quadrants. So he's a lawyer, so he put law on top, but architecture is the technical architecture. Norms are sort of the values and norms of society, and I'm going to grab my water. And the markets are sort of the businesses, the market, the economic reasons for things to happen. So the example that he gives in the book, which is a good example, is if you have a street and you want to get people to drive slower, you could put speed bumps, which would be a technical intervention, or you could post a speed limit and have a police officer enforce a speed limit, and that would be a legal intervention. And in many cases, you have the choice of whether to do a legal intervention or or you could have norms. You could make it very clear to everybody in the neighborhood that it's not a cool thing to drive fast. Or you could kind of create some sort of car that if you drove fast, you had to pay extra. So there's different ways to intervene. Interestingly, this class we have, a lot of engineers, we have a lot of lawyers, we also have philosophers and neuroscientists, and a bunch of different people. You probably would put yourself in one or more of these quadrants as a professional. And as you try to affect the behavior of people or the future of society, you're probably using the tool that you're most familiar with to do that. But like with the speed bumps, last year's class, which was more about broadly about internet and technology and society. This year, it's going to focus a little bit more on AI. One of the best conversations I saw was one of our cryptographers talking to a lawyer, and at that beginning, it was the law to him seemed like the laws of physics, something that you had to sort of build technology around. But to the lawyer, they thought of cryptography as some brick, or maybe even something bigger, like a dollhouse, that they had to build the laws around. But it turns out that cryptography is like putty, that you could make it to and do really interesting things with it. And that the law was also a product of a bunch of conversations and designed by people. And when the lawyer and the cryptographer got together, they realized that there are many problems that we had that could be solved either by cryptography or by law, but even better by sort of putting both of those together. So I think through the course of this course, you will hopefully start to see all 4 of these quadrants as areas that you can use to think about how we might affect the future. Now, I'll talk about it towards the end, but notice that I didn't say to make the world a better place, because I think that that's one of the problems, is that we seem to think often that we're all on the same page about what we want to do, which is where the ethics stuff comes in. Can you, I don't know if I can click that to go back. Can you play that for us? So this is just a little bit of where we are.
Human beings have played games against computers. At first, computers struggled, but then they started winning.
Watson, what is greed? Yes.
And now they've become so dominant that they're raising doubts about the future of humanity. The latest emblem for existential dread is Google's
Actually,
DeepMind project,
keep it
which
up.
created AlphaGo,
It's
an
short.
AI program that's become unbeatable at the most complex strategy game on the planet. While the game of checkers has 10 to the power of 20 possible outcomes, and a game of chess has 10 to the power of 40 possible outcomes, Go has more than 10 to the power of 80 possible outcomes. AlphaGo is trained to analyze situations itself by breaking the game down into tiny parts and visualizing all possible moves. Last week, it played the world's best Go player, 19-year-old Ke. With the help of a human handler, AlphaGo beat him 3 times, and after doing what it was designed to do, retired from the game.
在这次比赛完之后，在他继续又不停的进步之后，我觉得他对我而言就是100%。
If a system like AlphaGo can learn all the moves in Go well enough to beat a person, then it has the potential to replace lawyers and accountants among dozens of other jobs. It might be perfect, but it has no way to navigate human politics. The Chinese government banned the live stream after Joi lost the first game. The loss to an American company was an attack on the country's pride.
The Chinese government has made a big effort to proclaim that they are moving ahead rapidly in artificial intelligence, that they will be the people who dominate AI. To have the dreaded Google come in and beat China at its own game, it's just piling insult on top of insult. It's kind of amazing.
But it was more than a national crisis.
对我而言就是对围棋的上帝。阿尔法狗出现之后，可能真的我对人生啊，包括不是仅是围棋啊，对人生啊也有巨大的一个改变和看法。
Okay, so first of all, the science is all wrong. Just to be clear, it doesn't compute all of the moves. Actually, it's impossible. There are more moves than there are atoms in the universe. So that part's wrong. And just the way they describe it is really not isn't correct. It actually is fundamentally different from chess in that because it can't compute every move, it is doing something that looks a lot more like creativity, a lot more like intuition. So we will go into this later in more of the AI stuff. But first of all, commentary, the science is wrong. The second piece is see how quickly they move it into a us versus China thing, which is I think also a thing that the media is trying to do. And I think we'll have conversations later about whether that's true, and if that's true, what we do about it. But I think it's also interesting because they said, it can't get involved, it can't do human politics. Well, that's not necessarily true. It may be, and this is something we should talk about during the class, because I think that some people do believe that a lot of what politics is, not all of it, is a game. And the extent to which computers get better and better at winning games, it's possible that machines may do more than, can we advance? Back one. Okay, so I'm going to talk over this one. So this is, and actually we actually have somebody here from OpenAI, so I use this. So this is OpenAI, which is a nonprofit in Silicon Valley that's funded by Sam Altman and Elon Musk and a few others. And this is actually a multi-user game, which is very, very complex. And OpenAI has been able to win in tournaments. And there are other things that they've been doing at OpenAI that show that these machines can, by playing against themselves, much like how AlphaGo did, but with even less supervision in some of these cases, start winning at all kinds of games. And I guess I don't know how much of it is publicly available, but I'll just say that this is a very complex game, but they're also doing things that involve lots of physics, and that I would say, again, I don't remember exactly what they said I can say, but they have a rough idea or a belief that machines will be able to win at any game against humans pretty soon. Okay, and so the interesting thing here, and the meta point that I would have here is that the particular person I talked to was like, so it's the end or the beginning or something, but it's a big deal, and it is a big deal because a lot of things are games. Markets are like games, voting can be like games, war can be like games. So if you could imagine a tool that could win at any game, who controlled it and how it is controlled has a lot of bearing on where the world goes. On the other hand, when I was probing, a lot of people say, well, if it can win at any game, it's a super intelligence. So there are roughly three categories of artificial intelligence that people, or let's say 4. So there's artificial intelligence broadly, but then inside of that there are 3. One is AGI, so artificial general intelligence. So things like OpenAI, where you can point it at a general problem without giving it much detail, like all of the Atari games, and it will figure out how to win, and it will win. And so it's a very undirected general intelligence, and AGI is the idea that you make something so general that it can solve just about any normal problem. ASI, which is super intelligence, is the thing that Nick Bostrom and Elon and others are afraid of, which is that the machine gets so smart that it starts training itself and gets smarter and smarter and smarter until it's smarter than human beings. But the intelligence part is actually kind of interesting, because when we say intelligence, what does it mean? So the problem is a lot of my friends in Silicon Valley, when I talk to them about the future of this, they say, well, so they will win. And I said, what does it mean they will win? Well, life is a game, and they will win. And that's where I realized, okay, well, there are at least 2 categories of people in the world. People who, like one of my friends, knows exactly how many hours they need to spend with their wife, knows exactly the balance of the happiness that they get from their money versus their things, and they can basically describe to you in sort of metrics how they measure happiness, and that if they can optimize for happiness, they win at life. And so if you believe that life is a game that you can win at, then you could probably imagine that a computer can beat you at life. But if you believe that life is not a game, like I do, like I believe that I'm a bunch of chemicals and molecular interactions, and every morning I wake up and my endocrine system tells me what I yearn to do that day, and my life is all about trying to fulfill the yearnings that come through not just my endocrine system, but my relationships and my existence in the world. And that I think we have a somewhat spiritual idea that we have a consciousness, and we have an understanding. And the word understanding is pretty interesting, because a lot of these, when you hear people describe things like OpenAI, they say they get so good at this that the machine understands what's going on. So that's a pretty interesting use of the word understanding, and it goes back to actually a really, it's in your readings, but the China Room thought experiment. So if you read your readings, this will be redundant, but the idea is basically that if you put a person in a room who doesn't understand Chinese, but has a set of instructions that say, if this comes in one window, which is in Chinese, and it's a question, you can pull together and then output this, which is the answer in Chinese. And so if you have a complete set of instructions of what to do when this phrase comes in, and you're just looking at squiggles now, so you don't understand what the Chinese is, but you have a lookup table that tells you what the answer to the question is, which is also a bunch of squiggles, and you're putting it out, you could appear to an outsider who's putting questions in one end and getting answers in the other, as if you perfectly understood Chinese. But in fact, you yourself in the middle, who is the program, which is kind of like the AI, in fact doesn't understand anything except the ability to execute on the instructions that you have, which is if this comes in, then put that out. And in the readings, you have a lot of peer review and critique about this, but the general question here is, just because you can produce the right answer, it doesn't necessarily mean, at least to all people, that you understand what's going on. And again, this is kind of a recursive, and I'm glad we have a couple of philosophers in this class this time, because this becomes a very philosophical question. First of all, does it matter, right? So I think Elon, who is one of the funders of OpenAI, I don't know if it's a joke, and we have somebody here from his organization whether it's a joke, but he often says that there's a 90% chance that we're living in a simulation, right? And it's an interesting point. I think there are a lot of people in the world who believe that the world can be reduced to zeros and ones. And if in fact we're living in a simulation, it's pretty easy to go from there to imagining that if computers can manipulate bits at scale and tackle the complexity that we've been fighting against, that they could somehow understand the world. And then there are probably others who probably don't believe that we're living in a simulation, and that this doesn't constitute understanding. We understand something more. But again, it gets into a philosophical debate. I tweeted the other day my own belief, which is those people who believe the world is a simulation are probably those who are most likely to be simulated by computers. So now, so we can talk more about this general intelligence. It's a really interesting philosophical question, but we're not there yet. And OpenAI may say that we're going to be there really soon, and we should talk about it. So I'm not taking it off the table, but I want to focus a little bit on machine learning, which is a dumber version, but still a very powerful tool that is actually deployed already. And the idea about machine learning is that it basically gives the computers to learn without being programmed. So when we say algorithm in AI or machine learning, it's very different than an algorithm that we typically think of. So when you heard about the Volkswagen that was sort of programmed to not meet the environmental standards, you could open it up and deconstruct it. It's compositional, and you could read it and see and audit it, right? The way that a machine learning algorithm works is that you feed it data, you turn knobs, and it sets a bunch of weights in this neural network in a way that you can't look at the neural network and understand what it's going to do, just like you can't rip open somebody's brain and understand what they're thinking. And so while it is an algorithm in the traditional sense that it does things based on functions, it's a lot harder to understand exactly what it's going to do, and it's a lot more like our brains in that your child, you know what textbooks your child has, and you know the genetics that went into your child, but you sure don't know exactly what your child's going to do or become. And so as we start to think about the future of machine learning, we have to realize that it's a very different thing. And just as a side footnote, because you're not sitting there programming it, it actually takes up less space in many cases. It's very expandable. It's very powerful. But when we say programming, we often are programming the system in which we use to teach or allow it to learn. We're not programming the actual algorithm. So even rules like the Isaac Asimov's rules of robotics, it's a little bit harder to do that than you might imagine. And I'm not going to do this. We might do a primer tomorrow on AI and machine learning, but even in machine learning, there are many, many ways, categories of machine learning, many specific methods, and most things like AlphaGo was a combination of several different types of machine learning, and a lot of machine learning is kind of a fine art of picking which sorts of algorithms in which order, what the tunings of the knob are, and it really is kind of a dark art. And so one of the troubles that we have right now is that you have to get pretty good as an engineer before you're going to be able to train a useful machine. And so unlike VisiCalc in the old days where any accountant or business person could become creative and generative on a computer, machine learning is not yet to the point where the normal average person without specialized training can create something useful out of it. Although that's something we'd like to see. One of the main applications that we are all using day to day is classification of visual images. So right now, through using data sets, Google and Facebook and other places, whether it's facial recognition or the recognition of objects, it has a very high accuracy of categorizing images. And this is now mostly more accurate than human beings and faster. And it works on things like self-driving cars. The problem is it's a great tool, but people still end up misapplying it. This is also in your readings. It's Wu and Zhang. It's some Chinese researchers who took government IDs and now assert in the paper that over 90% accuracy in predicting whether somebody is a criminal by the photo. Right. Now, the article in your readings goes through and sort of deconstructs how they might have gotten to that problem. If you notice, all the non-criminals have white collars. So it could be that the machine is just figuring out that it's the white collars that signify. They also point out that the people who are criminals tend to not have as happy faces. And so, but the problem is because you're training this model and it isn't able to explain to you exactly what it's learning, you don't know for sure how it's getting to that accuracy. But the problem is that if you suddenly trained a machine on a data set and then you say, okay, it turns out we're 99% accurate, we're going to roll it out. And then it puts every white-collared person into a job and puts every non-collared person into prison, or dark-skinned person into prison, or a white-skinned person into a job, or whatever other problem. So the problem with machine learning is that we don't exactly know, and it may be surfacing a bunch of really interesting underlying factors. Now, this goes all the way back, right? So if you think about how Nazi Germany started the Holocaust, it was this whole notion that we have evolutionary traits, and by eliminating certain categories of people, society would get better. There was eugenics that sort of led up to that, which was the idea that the shape of your head or the form of your body somehow was an indicator of your social value or your criminality. And the fact that we have modern papers coming out just as recently as last year trying to use machines for this shows that we have this risk of what many people call reductionism, which is that often you come up with a scientific theory that sounds great, you apply it, and it actually is an oversimplification, and it can cause a lot of harm. So that's one of the biggest categories of harm that I see that is already happening. This is an interesting. I wonder if we can click that. This is actually an MIT project, and I think Jenny from this is your team, right? So this is an adversarial system. So this is a 3D print of a turtle that Google thinks is a turtle appropriately, but by fiddling with I think it's the pattern and some of the lines, right? They were able to modify the turtle so that Google now thinks it's a rifle. And there have been attacks like this where you set up sort of change some of the pixels on the image and are able to make things misclassified. I think this is the first time that something very general like a 3D object that you could hold in your hand now always looks to Google like a rifle. So there's this one category which is maybe you mistakenly start to mess up the classification because you don't notice that all the non-criminals have white collars. But if you actually try to attack the system by creating an adversarial system, you can do this. And there's also another rumor that I heard that kids were cutting out like craft paper, stop sign shapes, and like putting in front of Google cars and jamming them all up. And so that quickly shows you the limits of machine learning. A human being would know immediately that if they saw some teenage kid with a piece of craft paper that it wasn't a stop sign, but a car gets very confused. So I think one of the things that as we start to jump into, and actually I think there's a assembler project working exactly on this sort of adversarial jamming thing. But what's interesting is that because machines are so smart and so good at what they do, we suddenly think that they're going to be good at everything. And they're really bad at some things that we are obviously good at. And I think one of the key things as we think about the relationships between humans and machines is I think at least in the short run, there are going to be a ton of things that we're really good at that machines are not going to be good at, and vice versa. And figuring out what that relationship is going to be key. That's going to involve law. That's going to involve norms. It's going to involve things like user interfaces. And I don't think we're there yet. And that's one of the things I'd like to explore in this class. Let me see. Okay, so this is an angiogram, but I'm just going to use this slide generally to talk about medical imaging. So medical imaging, it turns out, is a great application of computers for machine learning, because now with a cell phone, you could send a picture of a tumor, or you could send a picture of your skin, and the computer can come back and give you results. And in many, many fields now, they're showing that the machines are much better than human beings. And I heard a confidential study the other day that there was a particular test, and they did a study of allowing doctors to overrule the machine, and 70% of the times that the doctor overruled the machine was right. So in other words, 30% of the time the doctor was right. So that's scary, right? So if you're a doctor, are you going to overrule the machine's recommendation when you have a 70% chance, more than 50% chance, that you're going to be wrong and somebody might sue you because you've overruled the computer? So they were all, and this is a big company, was how are we going to do this? And it's setting up this adversarial relationships. It's similar in an airplane. You overrule the autopilot, or in my Tesla, you overrule the autopilot. So there's this, kind of a interrupt-driven adversarial relationship. I talked to somebody who was involved in a startup the other day that has and I'm not supposed to give away the details, but it's a medical imaging thing that's 90-something% accurate, but doctors are generally 90% accurate in that field. So the machine is slightly more accurate, but still accurate enough, more than doctors that it was worthwhile. They also had the same problem where the doctors didn't want to give up control to the machine, but they changed the interface so that the doctor is always in charge and you don't see the machine. And whenever the machine sees a result that's different than what it believes, it sort of highlights the area, and that it notices might be the thing that's different. And it's like a spell checker. So the doctor's like, click, click, okay, click, click, okay, and then click, and there's a little red thing. And they, oh yeah, I didn't see that, okay. And so suddenly, instead of having an adversarial relationship with the doctor, you have the machine looking over the doctor's shoulder, kind of giving suggestions, but it's still the doctor's choice about whether to take the suggestion. And in 90% of the cases, the doctor's just doing it, and the machine's not saying anything. So I think the idea of having the machine looking over the doctor's shoulder, but also the driver of the car saying, wait, that's just a kid with a bunch of craft paper overruling the machine. That kind of relationship of looking over each other's shoulder rather than being an adversary of each other, I think is a really important one. It does, and this will start to tie to some of the law school stuff, it does start to get blurry, though, on whose responsibility it is right now. When you crash a Tesla in autopilot, it's your problem in America. I think if you crash many of the European cars, it's their problem. So this whole idea of this what we call the moral crumple zone, right? So which is this idea that people are going to be pushing responsibility onto others is one of the things that these computer-assisted systems will have. We'll hear later in the afternoon from Karthik and also Pratik, who work in medical systems. Karthik's work is very interesting. So he's taking now the conversation between the doctor and the patient before they take the angiogram, and then he shows later. What he's finding is that the doctor doesn't really understand, especially with male cardiologists and female patients. Women underreport pain, men overreport pain. So most male doctors misdiagnose women's cardiology tests. But once you have a machine, the machine actually, through learning the conversation, can often guess what the problem is better than the doctor or the patient. And he was also saying that the nurse and the patient actually is even better. So maybe in the future what you're going to have is you might eliminate the doctor, but you probably won't eliminate the nurse. It will probably be a nurse augmented with a machine to be able to do things. And so the conversation between a human and human is actually really important to add additional information to the data. So again, I think that's interesting. The other thing that Pratik will talk about is sometimes machines will find patterns that humans don't. So we have a lot of frameworks that we use in order to sit down and try to figure out where we look. But it turns out that when you start to get machines that look at medical exam images, they might start to see patterns that we never thought meant anything. And so this gets into, I think it's in my next slide. It's not in my next slide. It gets into explainability, because there may be things that when we're trying to get machines to explain everything, but there may be things that the machines can't explain because we don't have a framework in which to understand it. And they may actually help us come up with ways, just like AlphaGo created a whole new way to play Go by doing a very creative move that humans hadn't thought of. It could be that machines will surface ways to look at medical images that we haven't even thought of as human beings. This is I think many of you probably read this paper. I think it's now about 2 years old. But it's by Julia Angwin, who's a director's fellow at the Media Lab. And we assigned it as reading last year, and one of our participants, Madars, read this. And this is basically a paper that describes the use of risk assessment or risk scores in the judicial system. So basically, it's not even machine learning or AI. It's just a bunch of numbers that get put into an algorithm that create a risk score that people use to determine pretrial bail, or in some cases sentencing, and in some cases parole. And she's a data scientist that took over a year to put together the data to show that the system was biased. It was biased against people with dark skin, and it was roughly neutral for white people. And so we jumped in and said, okay, this is a problem. We're a bunch of engineers. Maybe we can solve this. Maybe we should have a blockchain and have it so that we can audit it. But as we started to go in and we brought in an ethnographer, we realized that it was a much deeper problem. So there's one argument that said that even though it's biased, it's still reducing jail time for people compared to human judges, right? And it's actually more fair to white people than black people, but at least it's more fair to somebody. There's another argument that was saying, okay, but they're not ingesting race as one of the inputs, but they're ingesting proxies to race. So it's somewhat racist, But it turns out that the underlying data is racist because that's how society is racist. And then the question becomes, okay, well, if it's just reflecting the underlying data, and the underlying data, the underlying society isn't fair, is it the machine's job to make society fair? No, right? The machine's job, at least in this particular case, is trying to accurately assess risk. And if a kid has the wrong circumstances, they will, sort of technically speaking, be higher risk. And so then it gets into this bigger problem, which is, well, shouldn't we try to address the underlying causes? If this kid from this zip code has a higher risk than the kid from this zip code, shouldn't we try to figure out why this zip code has higher risk and go after that? And Adam Foss is here, and he's a prosecutor who works on this stuff. And so can we use machines to go after the underlying causes rather than just more accurately predict and make the current system more efficient? So this is Karthik's work, and we wrote a paper recently for a conference on this, but a lot of machine learning, almost all of it right now, is about accurately predicting things. So this is correlation. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because you're in this zip code and you went to this school, you're a bad person. It just means that you're more likely to be a bad person, or not even a bad person. You're more likely to be failure to appear if you live in these places. And it's not correlation, it's causation. Or not causation, it's correlation. So the question that we had, and we had a person from the Catholic Church who was with us, and he pointed out the most strongly of all the people that it's not right. The justice system should not be punishing people by longer terms or inability to get bail just because they happen to live in the wrong zip code, right? And so then it becomes, but that may be the most effective utilitarian way to predict that outcome. So this correlation versus causation is actually really important because it's harder. So there's and again, we'll get Karthik to talk about this, but the causal inference, which is a way to try to change the underlying causes to figure out what variables are just correlations and what variables are actually causes to it. So for instance, if you remove that variable or change that variable, does it change the outcome? And we are working in towns like Chelsea and in certain jurisdictions where they're giving us more access to the underlying data to try to see what the causes are and to try to come up with a new way of doing machine learning so we can go and try to fix the problem rather than just focusing on the place. And we'll do a whole day on criminal justice, but what I wanted to, the point I wanted to make with this sort of rambling, meandering path here was that what might look like a simple problem on the surface, machines are biased, actually when you start to drill down and try to understand the whole thing, it's like peeling an onion or shaving a yak or whatever metaphor you want to get. It turns out it's a big societal thing that gets to the fundamental thing. Should we rethink the criminal justice system? Is the law the right way we approach these problems? Is this an opportunity to make the world more just? Or is this just an opportunity to make every subsystem in our whole society just slightly more efficient and make us efficiently just as bad as we are today, or worse? And Norbert Wiener, who was a famous mathematician here at MIT, said that when you're in a company or a bureaucracy, that it is automation. So you have a bunch of rules, you have all these things. Now corporations have all kinds of rights that make them have rights like human beings, and that human beings in the corporations are just machines of flesh and blood. And so a lot of the questions that we have about governance and AI, I think we're already seeing these when we see corporations that are able to grow and spend money and become entities that are completely out of control. So if you look at the market today, we can't understand it. Human beings do not understand the market. More than half the trades are done by machines. It's completely out of control. Most corporations are above the law. They don't pay tax. They can lobby. And so in a way, if you just imagine corporations as machines, and they are, we're already in a world of non-human intelligence. And our ability to regulate or deal with them has not been, is not very good. And so if you imagine AI, machine learning, as just booster rockets to all the elements in these machines, it's just going to be more and harder version of the problem that we have today. So at the Media Lab, we don't use the word artificial intelligence as much. We like to use the word extended intelligence, because artificial intelligence makes it feel like there's another sort of Terminator-like robot that's an artificial human that's intelligent and and conscious and wants to take over the world and has all the sort of attributes of humanness. What I think is going to happen is we're just going to see, and we already are seeing, machines and algorithms seeping into every part of our society, from the individual, our phones, which are our prostheses, to societal systems, governments that are using machines and search engines and so on. And so I think it's much better to think about, and extended intelligence is sort of a play on collective intelligence, which is a whole field. And we have the Center for Collective Intelligence here at MIT. And the idea that a group of humans or a group of things can get together and as a network think and act and do things. And so I think that artificial intelligence is again the wrong metaphor. And for better and for worse, I think we need to think about this as an integrated system. The problem is when you have a complex system, you can't just go back and say, okay, let's just redesign the whole thing, because you can't stop the machine. So it's not like creating a new nation where you can sit down and say, let's come up with the laws and now we'll make everyone behave this way. It's like trying to rebuild the plane as we fly it. So this is no longer, as a designer, an option. We can't just stop and restart, although we're trying. I love this example. So everybody knows Monopoly, right? So there's a precursor to the game called the Landlord's Game from, I think it's 1905, or this patent maybe 1904. And this game had nearly the same rules, but it was created by the Georgists, and they were sort of the precursors to the communists. So this game was created to show how ownership and rents drove people to unhappiness and poverty, and was about teaching about the perils of capitalism. So during summer, they would have kids play this to understand how awful capitalism was. And so Parker Brothers came around and said, that's a really pretty cool game, but let's just change the goal. The goal is you're the capitalist and you drive your friends to bankruptcy and you win. And it became a very popular game. And the reason I point this out is that a lot of our jobs as engineers or as lawyers is to try to change the rules, right? But if you change the goal and keep the rules the same, and the behavior changes, might we not extrapolate that even if we fiddle with the rules, if we don't change the goal, maybe that's not going to have a lot of effect, whether we're talking about climate or we're talking about things like crime. So I want to go pull all the way back out to much higher than 30,000 feet. And think of the Earth. So right now we have systems where you have photons coming in, and photosynthesis allows the photons to take water and carbon dioxide and convert them into oxygen and glucose, and then other things. Then so first of all, if you know your history, I think it was when photosynthesis first came out, it was one of the largest extinction events in the history of the Earth, because oxygen was toxic for many things. It took many key elements out of the environment, and so it was a huge extinction event, but a whole bunch of new organisms and new processes were created that took the glucose and the sugar and turned it into other things. And if you look at nature, what happens is when there's an abundance of something, something gets created to take that abundance and convert it into something else. And then that something else becomes the input for something else. And so the whole world is a bunch of loops of one thing being the output for another and another thing being the output for another. And there's no single currency. It's all kind of interconnected. And we have our human body it's the same, so it's across scale. So we have at the sort of molecular level it's happening, but at the geological level. And somehow the Earth's temperature is able to stay somewhat stable. Our body temperature amazingly stays stable, and then you can take huge percentages of the processes in our body and rip them out, and we're still able to function. We can eat very different foods, and we're still able to function because we have self-adaptive, robust, complex systems, so that when you sort of disrupt it, we're very resilient. And that's how complex systems work. And it's an evolved system. It's not a design system, but it's a great way to think about how everything is connected to everything else. And there's a whole field called systems dynamics, and it was used a lot in the 60s and 70s to model the world, things like poverty and war. But the basic idea is that you have things that come into a system goes out of a system, and then there's feedbacks. So I think I'll use an image this is my bathtub, to describe it. So if you have a bathtub, and you turn on the faucet, you will see the bathtub fill up. And then you have a drain, and depending on how open the drain is, it starts to drain out. And depending, if you're trying to get the water to a certain point, that's sort of the target of where the water wants to be. And so what you're doing is you're turning it on and you're closing it, and that's the flow, and the amount of water is the stock, and then you've got outflow. And so a simple system, the small bathtub is harder because it fills up more quickly. A big bathtub, like the ocean, it moves more slowly. And then imagine that you're trying to get it to exactly the right temperature so you get in. So you've got hot water. Now imagine, as many of you might have, where your boiler is really far away from your water, so it takes a little bit longer for the water to get to your boiler. And then imagine that you have to worry about where the water's coming from, and then the system that's heating the water. And then you kind of think about everything as a system of inputs and outputs to other systems, because your boiler also has a stock, and the energy has a stock. And so the whole world is just a huge network. Your bank accounts of basically this model of stocks, things coming in, things going out, and things connecting to each other with a bunch of pipes. So the world is a bunch of tubes. And so system dynamics people, what they do is they can imagine, so one of the favorite examples is there's this game, it's called the beer game, and they teach it in business school. And what they do is they make 3 groups. One is the distributor of the beer, the store. The other is the wholesaler, and the other is the brewery. And what they show is that they say, okay, one day suddenly people start buying more beer. So the store orders more beer. Then the distributor suddenly gets a whole bunch of, because there's a bunch of stores, a bunch of orders, and they don't have enough, so they can't ship them out, so they order more beer from the brewery. And every person plays a rational actor, where they're ordering more, and then it doesn't show up, so they order even some more. But in most cases, even though everybody's trying to do the right thing, the whole system goes bankrupt. And when you look at the input, the only thing that has changed is the amount of demand for the beer has doubled. And the only cases in which the system doesn't go completely bankrupt is when each of the nodes imagines what might be happening in the other nodes. If they're just working rationally in their own node, oh, I ordered beer, it didn't come, so maybe I better order twice as much for next week so that I could have enough to fill then you completely screw up. And so the whole sort of science of systems dynamics is to show that if you think about things in systems, they make sense because they're complex and adaptive. But if you think about things in terms of the autonomous units, it can go wildly out of whack. So this very busy slide is Donella Meadows, who was a famous systems dynamicist here at MIT. But she talked about how you intervene in systems to try to get a system to be more healthy or resilient or robust. And this is kind of a weird, and there's a great essay that you should Google and read if you're interested. But the top one is the least effective, but the one we use the most, which is changing the parameters and the numbers and the constants. And you can go down and start to change things like the structure of the flow, so which pipes are connected to which ones. You can change things like the size of the bathtub. You can change the flow. But as you go down, you start to see the power to self-organize, because so again, unlike a bathtub, society, markets, and the ecosystem are actually dynamic systems. But you see the last 3, which are the goals of the system, the mindset and the paradigm, and the power to transcend. So going back to corporations, so right now the goal of a corporation, roughly, is to eliminate the competition, to return shareholder value, and to externalize their costs, right? So it's kind of like cancer. So normal cells, normal human cells, if they end up in the wrong organ, they eliminate themselves. When they're out of context, they don't grow. But cancerous cells, regardless of their context, they take all the free energy they can get, and they grow as much as possible, and that's why the system breaks. One of the, I think, problems that we have right now is that the goal of many of our important systems is just to grow, and grow out of context. In the old days, when you had a company and you set it up, the first companies, you had a charter. And the companies were usually, okay, we need a windmill for this village. We will create a charter about the fact that we need the windmill and how we're going to govern it. And then we're going to collect a bunch of money to execute on this charter. That's sort of the initial reason that incorporation happened. And it was not until quite recently, in the 60s and 70s, that we started to think about the shareholder as a primary customer of the company, and more. Now, having said that, recent studies show that millennials, many of you, I guess, the majority won't join a company that doesn't care about social values. We do see things like Uber and other places for social reasons. Companies are getting taken to task. But still, I think the overriding goal of many organizations is to increase financial returns. The paradigm of this is the fact that we're measuring things in financial terms. So I was recently in New York, and somebody said, well, how can he be smart? He's not rich. And so the idea that if you're smart, you must be rich, and if you're not rich, you must be dumb, is actually quite a common way for people to think about things. And it's also because we measure things that way. So GDP, so when we talk about the competitiveness of nations, we talk about GDP. So GDP is how productive you are. So when Jonathan and I are taking care of our respective children, that's not contributing at all to GDP. So the countries don't measure that as success. But if I break that window, that will contribute to GDP because it will create jobs and things will move and money will get spent. So, and this is a common metaphor that people use, but breaking windows increases GDP, whereas taking care of your children don't. And often there's a number cited that says that IT hasn't contributed to productivity gains. And that's a lot of it is because the qualitative stuff doesn't contribute to GDP. It's only when things move around. So GDP is a financial metric that is really good at moving stuff around. And again, the behavioral economists will argue with me and say that you can measure so many things financially, even suicide or happiness. You just have to get the formula right. And that don't throw away economics and accounting just because we haven't gotten that right. And to me, it's kind of like somebody arguing that you can understand music and mathematics. Of course you can, and you can represent a song on a CD just as a string of bits. But is mathematics the way you want to enjoy music or even to create music? And that's the question. And I feel like the paradigm that we have right now, the mindset, is economics. And the most important one is the power to transcend paradigms. So to me, that's really important. That's questioning. Is this the way we should be measuring? That's what scientists do. That's what artists do. I'm going to make, I'll go back. And I think this is one of the things I want to do in this class. So when I think about philosophy or ethics, a lot of that is about our ability to reflect on whether the paradigm is the right thing, asking some of the basic questions. I was very heartened the other day. I was with a bunch of junior high school kids in Tokyo, and I had an hour with them, and I said, let's talk about climate. And one of the kids said, well, isn't it better if there are no humans for the climate? Are we talking about with humans or without humans? I said, oh, that's a good question. Let's say with humans because we're biased. That's our perspective. And then a ninth grade girl with her Japanese school out uniform said, well, but what about the meaning of life? Because don't we have to figure out what makes us happy and why we're here before we start to figure out the solution to climate? And to me, that was really heartening, that you could have a room full of kids going through a very stodgy educational system, which is the Japanese system, still asking some of these fundamental questions. And my concern is that a lot of these solutions that we're looking for in AI, whether it's in the criminal justice system or in the economy, assume certain paradigms, certain ways of going into the future that may not necessarily be the right way. And I think we're not questioning enough. This is an image from Iyad Rawan from the Scalable Cooperation Group, where I think a number of the students this year are from his class. But I think it's an interesting way to think about this kind of co-evolution, where you have society and you have machines, and they interact with each other, and it evolves. And now evolution isn't really, it's not a kind way for things to get better. But it's a little bit more, in my view, nuanced and appropriate than this optimization. So people try to optimize for things, and getting back to my friends who believe that you can win at life, they're optimizing for a number of variables. And I think that that's not really a very resilient way to think about life. And I'm going to make fun of my own institution, and so this is MIT's campaign, MIT for a better world, and people kind of know what you mean when you say a better world. It's for society and stuff like that. But I always ask, for who at what time scale, right? So for shareholders at a quarterly time scale, which is what most companies are doing, that's a particular set of outcomes that might destroy, won't spend money to train people, won't spend a penny more on the environment than they have to. Or is it for Native Americans who think at 7 generations? Or is it for biodiversity in eons, in which case humans are probably a problem? And so thinking about who at what time scale. Now what's interesting about human beings, I think, is that we think about many time scales at many things. When I'm sitting there meditating in the morning, I'm thinking about the universe at a very long time scale. But when I'm in a meeting negotiating with one of my faculty member over resources, I'm thinking at a very short time scale. And I think the diversity of time scales and the diversity of points of view that exist inside ourselves and inside of society is what creates this robust, complex, self-adaptive system, which isn't as good as nature, but it's getting closer. And the idea that we can reduce it to some sort of formulaic optimization that we can train a machine against, I think is a problem. It's reduction. And so one of the key takeaways for myself, and this is obviously a point of view, and many of you may disagree, but I'm kind of out to resist reduction. I don't want somebody like, and again, this is Godwin's law because I'm equating Silicon Valley with Nazis by saying that reductionism is like eugenics. But there are other examples like B.F. Skinner and learning. I think that when you get a lot of new science and technology, you get this urge to apply it to a bunch of societal problems. And if you are too reductionist and you don't embody the complexity, you do have the danger of going way out of context and thinking that a turtle is a rifle, or thinking that because somebody's skin color is one color, that they are a certain classification. And I urge us as we go into the nitty-gritty of law and technology that we don't forget, and this is why it's great, I see the two philosophers near the front, that we don't forget the context in which we live and the complexity. And my personal belief is that the fundamental nature that is humanity is not reducible, and that somehow we need to figure out how the reductionist part of our society and the irreducible part of our society coexist and help each other rather than hurt each other. Thank you. A bit of time for Q&A. So we have the weird Media Lab box. And the other day I had Kade interviewing Chelsea Manning, and she was really good at this, and I realized, she told me later she plays basketball. But any comments, any questions? Opinions are great too. Okay, I'm gonna send it to you, and then you can send it back. Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Pham.
And talk into the mic. That's actually a mic. The box.
Oh, hi.
Sorry, I should have.
This is awesome. Hi, I'm Kathy Pham. I am an assembler and also a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center. Something that I thought of while you were talking about corporations, Joey, whereas, yes, profits are a big factor, but entities like MIT and Harvard and other universities train the engineers, the humans that go and work there. And many, as you said, especially the millennials, want to do social good and have social responsibility. Mm-hmm. So how do we get that sentiment from the individuals into these companies that care about profits, et cetera, and make it so that the engineers working on these problems don't ultimately produce the problems and actually achieve the goals that they're perhaps striving towards with ethics and doing social good.
So you happen to be sitting next to some philosophers who will be able to help you, but I think so at the Media Lab we are using design as one of the cornerstones of this. So we have a journal called the Journal of Design and Science. And part of design is trying to understand all of the systems and the constraints. And so what I think that engineers need to do is understand, first of all, that everything they do affects a whole bunch of systems. So if you create an idea or a thing, you're affecting the aesthetic landscape, you're affecting the environment, you're affecting learning, you're affecting a whole bunch of things. And you may not be able to control everything, but you're responsible in the way that you're responsible for bringing a child into the world. And so by being responsible, at least you can then either iterate towards or feel some sort of, I'm calling it a sensibility, because I think so Neri Oxman and Mijin Kim teach a class called Design Across Scales, where we're talking about design at the sort of microbial level to the astronomical level, and that they're all connected. So if you have a sensibility, which is, let's avoid waste, too much is, more than enough is too much, be kind. And if every person at every scale is thinking that way and has a synchronized sensibility, I think the system will change. And this is more participant design, which is that every participant in the system has the ability to change the system. It's not the master planner. And so Kevin Slavin and I worked on this paper, and we were in traffic one day, and he said, you know, you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. And so I think the part of the engineer also is about, often you're a designer engineer, you're the object doing something to design for the subject. But if you start to just design things for yourself that you would want, and this is kind of the golden rule, do unto others, but if you are a participant in the system rather than a sort of outsider, that's another way to reframe the problem so that people think about it in their own context. But I think it comes with, and this class is the beginning of this, is to sort of bring these kinds of thoughts to scientists and engineers, especially scientists, who tend to think about things in very narrow, at a particular microscope setting in a particular field, rather than how everything is connected in a complex system. And then back. Oops. And then we'll just take these 4, and then we'll move on to. Is that too long, Jeff?
Hello. Oh, wow.
He's like, I want to talk.
Amazing. Thanks. So, Hallie Benjamin, I introduced myself yesterday, but I currently work at Google on identifying and testing for product bias, and I'm also an assembler. And this may be more of a comment or something just like a provoking thought exercise that we can start to get into over the course of this class. But it can be devastatingly frustrating to watch the sort of illumination of certain societal problems that, for some people to say, oh, coming back to your comment about the criminal justice system and things that people may start to realize there are problems, or there's the existence of this bias. And I think, one, it's so, I don't know what word to use, but just fascinating to see that there may have been people who have been crying for help for decades, and that it wasn't until this became a problem that was interesting to technologists or to people in certain positions that they would think we need to solve it. And then the second piece being, as we recognize the power and opportunity for machines and technology to help us uncover and start to solve some of these deeper, perhaps embedded societal issues and paradigms that we see the world through, who is it that's designing those experiments, and who has the power to think about which ones need to be solved? So recognizing that it has the power to sort of elevate voices that may have been too quiet or powerless before, but that who designs those experiments and who starts to look at what problems are worthy of solving is also just a really interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, and I think, and we can talk about it, I think, during class, but that's key. And we have Kevin Esfelt in our lab. He's one of the co-inventors of CRISPR gene drive, but he's working with the Maoris in New Zealand and sort of the communities in Nantucket to actually run the experiments themselves rather than us telling them what to do. And so there's informed consent and bioethics, and I think it's very similar with the criminal justice work that we're working on. And this is really starts to connect to Adam's work. Is how do we empower the communities to do this work themselves rather than sort of from the outside. So totally agree. Do you want us to hold questions and do first? Or do you want to do a few more?
Two more.
Okay, two
it's
more.
It's the answers I'm worried about, not the questions.
Hi, I'm DP. I'm one of the assemblers. Maybe on a lighter note, and I don't want to pick on Elon Musk, but the whole thinking of the super intelligence, there's always a dystopian tint on it. It seems that there's a correlation between the intelligence of it and the malevolence of it. And so I feel like that frames it in a certain way that maybe reduces the accountability of the people working on it, because if in the end it's going to be evil, yep, or it's not going to be better than us at our best, then we don't need to try our best. So it's like, it's kind of maybe a philosophical point, but why is that the narrative?
Well, I'll just point out that it's very interesting because the Japanese aren't afraid of machines like the Americans are. And I think it has a lot to do with, at least one hypothesis that I've heard is it has a lot to do with slavery. So the West has had slavery since, the Greeks, right? And so you've always had slaves and overthrows. And so we imagine us being enslaved by a superintelligence, where in cultures that had less slavery, that's not really the dynamic. And also because in Japan you have an animist system where you don't control things and animals so much. You don't have this fear that an intelligent thing is going to be evil. But if you are that evil person in real life, then you will be afraid of something that's smarter. So I think that's a cultural thing. That's the one thing that I think Japan has up, is that the AI is not as advanced, but I think the culture is going to be more, it's going to be easier for them to assimilate. And then the last one.
Hi, J.M. Porup. I'm a security reporter for CSO Online and former assembler. So I've been following the GDPR right to an explanation debate. This is hotly contested by legal scholars, and the normative question is also debated. The Berkman Klein Center just had a paper out criticizing the idea there should be a right to an explanation for automated decision making. My question for you as a technologist, is it technically feasible to give a right to explanation for automated decisions in all cases? Is that even feasible?
So this, I'm looking at JZ. There's a long answer and there's a shorter answer. I think the short answer is it's kind of complex. I think that in certain, and there's kind of a section of this, I'm not sure if it was in the readings, but first of all, it depends a lot on how necessary it is, right? So it will definitely add cost. It will definitely slow things down. And so in some cases, you may want to allow machines to run without explanation if the risks are low but the benefits are high. And there are certain situations where you want explanations. You will hear from Pratik later that in certain medical situations, we're actually learning from machines ways to think about things that we haven't been able to, it wouldn't be able to explain to us in the way that we understand. So by limiting the explanation to legal explanations or technical explanations, we may limit the ability for a machine to come up with certain types of ideas. So that's another risk that people think about. Different types of algorithms are easier to explain than other types of algorithms as well. So there's a lot of issues. I think it's a good idea, but I think it's something that we need to look at in a very context-sensitive way. And I think that there is but even human beings are not very good at explaining, and most of our explanations are sort of retrofitted excuses for what we decided to do. One of my favorite neuroscience things these days is that your brain has a physics engine. So when you see a bag of rice that's about to fall over, you're not actually computing with math that it's about to fall over, so you can't actually prove it. You just know that, and this engine, as my infant is now learning, starts to get this intuitive nonlinear model of the real world. And I think we do that. So if you're a skier, you ski, but you can't explain to somebody exactly what's good about your skiing versus what's not. And if you had to only do those things that you could write down, you wouldn't actually be a good skier. So the mastery of craft, even in our human brain, let alone computers, often is an unexplainable wiring of a complex system that just produces a result based on the way it's learned. And so that would be my concern, that explanation is a category of reduction, a reducibility to human cognitive understanding, which may limit the ability for us to design something that is actually maybe intuitively more sensible than something that is legally correct. So that would be another concern. But with that, I will hand it off to my legally correct torts professor.
I wonder if the answer to Jens's question doesn't have to do with the Donella Meadows slide that you showed, Joey, which is sometimes we want an explanation for its own sake. The explanation is the point. We are questing for reasons, and sometimes the explanation is the means to an end, an assurance that there isn't bias or something like that. So it's only in understanding the paradigm or the values from which you are wanting the explanation, and I think we can probably infer why the European regulators are eager to have such a thing as part of a right to privacy, that you can figure out whether there's something other than explanation that can satisfy the upstream right for which the explanation is trying to serve. And that's as good an introduction as any to some of the things I wanted to broach today. I certainly feel a certain feeling after hearing Joey's presentation, and more generally a certain feeling whenever thinking about the ethics and governance of AI, a sort of vague sense of unease. And that vague sense of unease is a feeling I'm familiar with, not just characterologically, having learned it tacitly from my parents, but rather from having studied the law and policy around the development of the internet. And having been involved in that and studied that for a number of years now, in fact, according to Joey, decades, that's given me some sense of syncopation, trying to make sense out of the current landscape for which there's sufficient unease all over the place that we convene a class around it. We build an AI fund around it. We trouble the European regulators who have plenty on their plate to want to be regulating towards it. And I think our goal broadly in an academic kind of enterprise is to be relentlessly lucid about identifying where our sense of unease comes from, make it less vague, to examine if it's really worthy. Joey's sort of provocative example comparing Japanese and American culture and their attitudes towards machines is really asking us to examine what the sources of our worries might be and if we just might want to chill out a little bit. Or if not, how to address those worries through the levers that we have, whether it's individual action or governance or something else. It's really hard to build this stuff up from the ground, and I suspect we'll get there, but it's certainly taken years in the internet space to even have a semblance of a coherent notion of what we're wanting to achieve and why and how we're going to do it. And so I just wanted to share my own sense of where this non-field field stands as we go about it. And I'm aware that Joey kind of opened with this too. It's against a backdrop, this vague sense of unease has these moments where really successful and therefore necessarily smart people have told us that they've thought about it and there's a real problem here. So Bill Gates insists AI is a threat. Given that it's a BBC article, it just might mean he just said the words AI, and then there was sort of some journalistic license. But he is worried about it. And we also have Stephen Hawking, the famed physicist, saying the primitive forms of artificial intelligence have proved very useful, but the development of full AI could spell the end of the human race. Now, it's true he told the BBC that again, but I do think that represents his view pretty well. Elon Musk, who's, among other things, behind OpenAI, says AI is nothing short of a threat to humanity. With artificial intelligence, we are summoning the demon. And there's also Nick Bostrom, who's sort of the philosophical kingpin of this movement, who's hedging his bets a little bit here. He does believe superintelligence can emerge, and while it could be great, it could also decide it doesn't need humans around or do any number of other things that destroy the world, which is kind of like the ending of an old story in Newsweek. For those who remember Newsweek, the kicker was always, the future is uncertain, but one thing is clear. If things don't get better, they could certainly get a whole lot worse. So hard to disagree with that. And so we'll have a chance, I think, even maybe tomorrow as we do some of our breakout groups, to talk about this kind of superintelligence thing. This is a weird way for me to dismiss it, but my dismissal of it is we have a number of problems in front of us right now. There's smoke coming from the console. Let's not worry yet that we're not sure if it's 50 or 100, but there could be, depending on all the assumptions you load into things, a real problem way down the road. I'm kind of wanting to solve the problem in front of us. So that's artificial intelligence. And when we say artificial intelligence, what do we mean by artificial intelligence? And I confess that it has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people. Joey had that chart just of machine learning and the different variants of that. There is the technologist's definition, or definitions, which can be very useful if you're trying to identify the tactical limitations and issues with a given technical system. So there's a real value in understanding and elaborating the actual systems we're talking about, but I think there's also a way of trying to think of it more broadly what we say when we mean AI. And I should also be clear, this class is on ethics and governance of AI. We're working with a fund on the ethics and governance of artificial intelligence. When we say ethics, it's not entirely sure what we mean. And when we say governance, we're not entirely sure what we mean. So there's a lot of stuff that is as yet not completely worked out in anything but the prepositions of the stuff we're talking about. And again, the relentless pursuit of lucidity is trying to map out a little bit of each of those to create a common vocabulary and not have the semantics be the thing we find ourselves arguing about unless the semantics turn out really to matter. So I'm going to try in the course of my talk today to limit a little bit of each of those zones. And we might as well start with artificial intelligence. This, of course, is the Terminator that Joi invoked. Old movie, but still a good one, I'm told. And sort of the blending of the human and the machine, part of the kind of visceral, no pun intended here, fear that lurking beneath a human skin is a machine that is at first passing and then later far more powerful than we are and perhaps out to get us. There's the predecessor to the Terminator, which was HAL 9000, which had no corporeal manifestation. It was just a voice that was maddeningly gentle, even as it was saying horrible things. I don't know how many people have seen HAL in Stanley Kubrick's 2001, but that's an interesting, again, sort of manifestation of having it be human-like but not worry about looking like a human. And of course, Siri and its counterparts, which do use the first person, emphasis on person, and really represent themselves to us, again, as a disembodied kind of creature here to help. And the very first appearances of Siri, as we'll see on the iPhone, were, "I am Siri, your humble assistant." They could have picked any number of adjectives like helpful, computer, thing, and instead they picked humble just to kind of pretermit the worries that, wait a minute, are you out to kill me? No, I'm your humble assistant, not that other assistant that is out to kill you. So for my part, when I say AI, let me tell you what I mean, and this will also explain why I have no career in marketing. When I think of AI, I'm really thinking of arcane, pervasive, tightly coupled, adaptive, autonomous systems. And these are each variables that could be tweaked to more or less. And the more you have, to my mind, of each of these, the more we're getting, I think, at some of the sources. And if we break down each adjective, we can then start to be more lucid about the sources behind the vague sense of anxiety we might be feeling of the pell-mell rush happening now, thanks to the magic of the markets, to make them pervasive, to make them in our pockets, in the world, running some of our industrial systems, all that sort of stuff. And when you actually look at this, a lot of these elements, as Joi was emphasizing through Norbert Wiener, exist in the artifice of a corporation, the legal fiction that exists, and in the ways in which any of us part of a corporation or an institution think of ourselves as speaking for it, or Harvard wasn't happy when X happened. It's like, really? Harvard wasn't happy? What does that mean exactly? But here then, to me, when I'm going to be talking about AI, I'll be thinking less about the mechanics underneath, even though that matters, and more about these qualities that are getting dialed up in ways that a difference of a degree can become a difference in kind that make us maybe want to be intervening in a more dramatic and resourceful way to avoid some of the futures that we fear. I also should correct this. Joey's right. I once used the word autonomish to say they're not fully autonomous. They've got humans involved or other things. So they're autonomish systems about which we have concern. So let me give you an example in the real world that I think many of us are familiar with. This is unlike, for example, in cyber law, where I felt like we had to spend 5 years around internet governance issues trying to persuade the world that it mattered. You're like, no, domain names, they really matter. For which, sorry, this is streaming, and everybody's watching from like ICANN, like they don't really matter that much, but we thought they mattered. Here, there's not that same persuasion having to happen. People somehow know that from this early day, remember Yahoo, when there was a search box and you might type something and then it would give you answers that humans had curated into categories, like an old thing called the Yellow Pages. They move along towards something like Facebook for family and friends to share their status with each other in an updated feed. And it's just, once you say it, it's wonder why we didn't have it sooner. And you start to see that it becomes a source of news and what I call agenda setting. You wake up, what's going on in the world? What should I care about? Less and less, I think, do we find ourselves consulting the regular media, but simply looking at these aggregators, our Facebook feed or our Twitter feed and its counterparts around the world, to tell us what's going on and what we should care about. And of course, these feeds are not identical across. They are personalized to us using algorithms that may be a little bit abstruse. We don't see how they work. And our own reactions become part of the personalization. This is a study that Facebook did, and honestly that only Facebook could do because it only had access to its data, showing that a number of days before a relationship is declared on Facebook between two what we assume to be people, there are behaviors going on that end up through a training algorithm. You can alert Facebook that these folks are about to be in a relationship, possibly before even they know it, which leads to some ancillary products that Facebook could offer, such as in-law alert, telling the in-laws that this is about to happen, and for a small fee that perhaps we could help to drive the would-be star-crossed folks apart. And it's just a way of saying, gosh, if they can do it with relationships, what else could they do it with? What else might it know that I'm getting interested in? And when I hear some of the excitement among AI folks talking about what they think is right around the corner with the data and the training that they have, it is anticipating human behavior to the individual level. And if you can anticipate it and predict it, even before the person may know where he or she is going, it might mean you can also shape it. And I think that's part of the anxieties we might be having. Back to just regular old agenda setting, a couple summers ago were the riots in Ferguson, Missouri, and there was a strange thing that a number of people noticed, which was that in their Twitter feed, they found all Ferguson all the time, and yet in Facebook feeds, which had roughly the same friends as the number and type of people they were following, in Facebook they weren't seeing it at all, and they were left to have to make inferences about it, which quite quickly went to the conspiratorial, such as, is Facebook trying to keep Ferguson out of the feed? I find myself skeptical of those sorts of explanations. It's an interesting hypothetical to ask, what should a Facebook do if asked by law enforcement in the interest of public safety not to incite riots by allowing live streams or other accounts to enter a feed of a riot in progress? Under what circumstances, if any, should they be responsive to that kind of request? And it turns out here the answer was that they had just introduced hosted video offered by users on Facebook, and they were really trying to promote it. And the video shown here is one of the more obscure versions of the Ice Bucket Challenge for ALS. So this was the Ice Bucket Challenge, and it went viral not just because it was compelling. I obviously have to get rid of that. Not just because it was compelling, but because Facebook had tweaked its own newsfeed algorithm, as it has the right to do, to promote user-submitted videos, to make that far more likely to show up amidst the 8,000 things it could choose to shove after the cat picture. It's like, oh, user-submitted video, let's just put a lot of weight on that because we want to get it up and running. That ended up, because there wasn't a lot of user-submitted video of Ferguson, pushing that down in relation to something like the Ice Bucket Challenge. And even Facebook ultimately had to do a little research to come up with that as what I take to be the actual explanation for a large part of the disparity between the two types of feeds. Now, there have been other times when we've seen platforms, by that we tend to mean these days in this kind of conversation, Facebook and Twitter and Google, usually through YouTube, are aware of their power. So there was an immigration, pro-immigration kind of PAC that Mark Zuckerberg had funded. That group did a PowerPoint deck trying to argue why they were well positioned to make a difference in that debate. And that deck leaked. And under a section called Tactical Assets, they said, we control massive distribution channels as companies and individuals. We saw the tip of the iceberg with a campaign against SOPA/PIPA, a US federal law that ultimately did not pass, thanks to a lot of grassroots and also AstroTurf internet pressure that made members of Congress reconsider. And they're saying, look, we've got these distribution channels. We can make Facebook be an instrument, perhaps, for changing minds. As you might guess, once this became public, Facebook very quickly disavowed any such intent. But it did get me thinking about the possibilities in a study that happened in 2010 in the congressional elections. Facebook, with some other researchers, but again, Facebook was necessary to this, decided to salt the feeds of its tens of millions of visitors from North America on Election Day, that November, with a simple note that looked like this, that said, today is Election Day, find your polling place, let us know if you voted, and here are some of your friends who have already voted. And they were curious to see, by reviewing the records of voting and tying it to the real names offered up on Facebook, whether or not that had a significant impact on those who voted, just that single alert in the feed that it was Election Day. And the answer was it absolutely did, by margins that were greater than that of Bush versus Gore in Florida in the year 2000. Of course, not so hard to do. It was very close in Florida the year 2000 between Bush and Gore. And that did get me thinking about whether or not it might be that something like Facebook could be a vector for tipping an election one way or the other in this review of Cassandra Studies published here. Sadly, no one listened. But anyway, that's the kind of thing that had me wondering about the power of the platform. Is that an AI worry? It's a worry about obscure systems and also asking us to identify who is wronged in the instance that Facebook, hypothetically, let's be clear, were to decide that it favored one candidate over another, maybe because one has a better stance on Facebook's immigration position, and simply chose to alert those Facebook users on Election Day who were likely to support that candidate. And they don't have to do much inference there. We often like what we like on Facebook. Alert them it's Election Day. And for those who are not supportive, don't alert them. Just give them the cat picture they so desperately know that they want. Is anybody wronged in that scenario? And I think yes, but I see dispute there. It's not clear. Are you wronging the person you told that it's Election Day? Are you wronging the person you didn't tell when you gave them what they wanted and they might not have otherwise have been told? I think you're actually wronging both of them, even the person you alerted. And a little later I'll explain why. In the meantime, the closest we've gotten to that hypothetical was this situation during a town hall meeting internal to Facebook where they were using a Q&A tool, again, internal to the company, for employees to nominate questions for Mark Zuckerberg to answer at the front of the room and then to vote, and presumably the most upvoted questions would be the ones they would probably ask. Here's this question with 61 votes. What responsibility does Facebook have to help prevent President Trump in 2017? This was in March of 2016, mind you, so it was election year with the election coming in November. Oddly, this question did not get asked of Mark Zuckerberg on the floor, but that's the kind of thing that is the sort of paradigm-busting question that Joey's example of the high school student evoked. And it created enough of a stir when that screenshot got released that Facebook had to convene a band of humans. At some point, I think this could be rather easily algorithmically generated to crank out a statement that was meant to be as anodyne and calming as possible to say that voting is a core value of democracy, supporting civic participation is an important contribution. We as a company are neutral. We have not and will not use our products in a way that attempts to influence how people vote. Notice, by the way, that this promise, which I'm happy to hear and in fact would love them to sign on the dotted line to kind of lock it in, this promise still doesn't reach my hypothetical of turning out folks who have already decided out of proportion versus those who haven't. That's not attempting how they vote, it just influences whether they vote. And that's, again, the kind of thing for which it's like, might be good to get the companies to say what they will and won't do. Also within the context of agenda setting are articles like this: FBI agent suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead in apparent murder-suicide, with a rather excitable photo of a house burning down. It turns out this is fake news, and by that I mean it is literally fake news. It's from the DenverGuardian.com. There is no such newspaper as the Denver Guardian. If you are in Denver, you cannot subscribe to the Guardian. There's not a box on the street with the Guardian inside. It is just a website that they know people won't even likely click through to. This is one of the few stories on it at the time. But it turned out when you look at the most shared stories during the last 3 months of the US election season in 2016, the Denver Guardian beat out our own hometown underdog, the Boston Globe, where the most shared story on the Globe had about 150,000 shares. The Denver Guardian was up to just under 600,000 shares. And the question to Facebook is, all right, we get that you are neutral. Does this mean this is not a problem? And Facebook's own view on that has evolved. I think now they're at the point where they say it is a problem, but that took a while. And it took a while because of their own chariness of trying to do anything other than say, well, whatever people share, they share, and that's it. Now that's, of course, in the organic feed ecosystem. Think a little bit about the advertising ecosystem, which is, of course, the financial underpinning at the moment to something like Facebook. And this was, I believe this is another ProPublica special, Julia Angwin and company, in which they got the idea, when you want to place a Facebook ad, you get to pick what characteristics of the target you want to exist for them to be shown the ad, and then you might find yourself paying a fee. So they got the idea of putting Jew hater as the field of study of any of the 2 billion, 3 billion Facebook users. If anybody happened to have typed those words as a field of study, then show them this ad. And Facebook, quite helpfully, doing some very simple algorithms, were like, you know what? We can suggest to you some other fields of study that might also relate in order to expand your audience and pay us a little more, such as, quote, how to burn Jews. Or if your demographic employer is the Nazi Party, you might quite like this. Your audience selection is great. Potential size, 108,000 people. Now, these, again, are not categories of the old Yahoo variety where there's some, like, demographer at Facebook that's like, this is a good category. It's what David Weinberg would call folksonomy, or perhaps we call volksonomy. This is the people speaking. Sorry, if I could redo it, I would. It's too late. It's a tightly coupled system. So that's the kind of thing, though, where figuring out what we are expecting of the system itself, what level of responsibility, is ultimately one of the questions. It was amazing to me, by the way, when you look more closely at some of the suggestions that Facebook made through its collaborative engine, there's a bunch of stuff that, if you have an employer of SS Nazi, makes sense, like German Schutzstaffel. But the very last one of Italy, NYC, I have no idea what makes Italy something that these groups would be liking. And you start to realize, too, Facebook reacted to this study, by the way, by acknowledging up front that it was extremely regrettable, that it was bad, that it should not happen. And then they're trying to figure out, do you do what you'd call a whitelist? You can't do anything. You can't name categories unless we previously approved them. Or should it be you can pretty much name any category that somebody has specified as a user to search on, except ones that we will try to exclude. And every time Julia Angwin writes an article, we'll just exclude more categories and thank her for her service. So anyway, you also start to see states behind the planting, dissemination, and impact of propaganda and fake news. In this case, possibly Russian-originating hackers behind a Qatar crisis. But we have some examples offered up by Facebook during their review of groups and ads, so organic and non-organic, stuff that was produced by the Russian government according to Facebook. And as you can see here, end sanctuary cities, deport illegals and close our borders. We're full, go home, no more refugees, no more illegals. like if you agree. I guess like if you agree. And these are things coming from another country designed to influence actions in the first country. And it's not just what they're thinking about, they're actually suggesting real world impact. So here is in Twin Falls, Idaho, an event chartered by Citizens Before Refugees with a rather evocative, scary photo of a citizen, I assume, being attacked by a refugee. And they actually called, and apparently, according to Facebook, 4 people went and 48 were interested in showing up in person, with the event itself having been orchestrated from afar, according to Facebook, by another government. So if you're looking for things to be nervous about that involve the kinds of systems with the kinds of adjectives I was talking about that amount to some measure of AI, I'd put this pretty high on the list in 2018. Now, there's also a movement, I think, for the kinds of systems I've been referring to as AI that Randall Munroe calls a movement from tool to your friend. And let me unpack those 2 words. If I go to Bing, which I assume there was brief excitement in Redmond, Washington, somebody has gone to Bing, and I gotta say, like, I try to give Bing the college try because it would be nice to have some competition in search engine space. So it's like, go for it, Microsoft. So I said, should I vaccinate my child? I did not share these results with Joey. If I look at the top results, it's no, 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 yes, no. Is that a problem? Is that a system that is buggy? Or is that a search engine that is working as designed? And I don't know, let me just take a quick poll of the audience, internet style. Hum at the count of 3 if you think, presuming this reflects something satisfying to the algorithm of which sites have the most rich links, the most activity, the kind of stuff normally judged in the abstract to be relevance. How many people say, you know, this is not Microsoft's problem? 1, 2, 3. Wow. How many people say this is a problem, Microsoft needs to fix it? 1, 2, 3. Huh. All right, so we have a kind of languid response from the audience. Maybe it's the first time we're humming, so we're not yet sure even about the modality, and I respect that. The old answer, the traditional answer is, it's not Microsoft's problem. It's not Google's problem, unless it's something systemic, unless SEO, search engine optimization, is taking over. This is a window onto the web. If the web is crappy, the results are going to be crappy. What do you want from me? That's how it works. And that's kind of the idea that Joey was adverting to, not approvingly, but adverting to of, we get systems to optimize. If what you're optimizing is already crappy, you just have highly optimized crap. And that may be the case, depending on your view of vaccinations, here. But there has been a reluctance by the search engines traditionally to hand tweak results. Now, if you see then on the left, this is Avishai Margalit, a colleague of mine. You can Google him. There's some stuff about him on the left. And over on the right is something that is now quite commonplace across all the search engines. This is a more oracular statement from the search engine that is meant to be kind of the bio of the person. And here you can see he's an Israeli professor emeritus in philosophy. Until 2011, he was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, which is weird because he died in 1962, which is especially weird since he emailed me last year and was like, what do I need to do not to be dead? Which is kind of a philosophical question, but also a quite practical one. And I'm like, oh, there's a feedback link. You should click feedback. Feedback, I am alive. And then wait, and I'm sure Google will correct it. And this is an example of a different thing. This is knowledge graph. This is trying to make some sense, to be relentlessly lucid, rather than shoving at you the first 10 things that it could grab and giving you an answer. On the left is a tool. It's a research tool. You just use it. You don't blame the tool if it hands you stuff from the corpus that is not so good. On the other hand, this is your friend. This is your advisor. This is giving you pre-processed stuff that you might find yourself relying on much more. And the same thing with appendicitis. If I Bing appendicitis, you know, they're not to be blamed, I think, as much at Microsoft if link number 2 turns out to be like something, inaccurate. But over here, when it's actually telling you about appendicitis in the knowledge zone, and it says it's, caused by an imbalance of the bodily humors, and you need a leaching, that's the kind of thing where it's like, Microsoft, maybe you shouldn't be saying that to people. It's wrong. And whatever you think about the organic area, we're moving, my claim is, from tool to friend. And there's this thing, lately in business, everybody's really in, when you say AI, they think you mean chatbots. I don't know why. Chatbots are really old, but chatbots are all the rage in business now. This is Facebook's M. Has anybody used Facebook M before? A couple? I'd be interested to hear your experiences with it. Here's somebody who, it's like somebody you friend in Messenger, and it's like your concierge. Why? It's not clear. It's just, I'm M, I'm here. Let me help you, like figuring out where to go to dinner, just to ask. So in this case, the person said, where should I get dinner tomorrow? I'd be happy to help you find something. Where are you, and what are your favorite types of food? And the person says, I work in Palo Alto. Are you a real person or an AI? I use artificial intelligence, but people help train me. I'll find some restaurant options for you. He wasn't done yet. He said, do you possess a physical manifestation? I live right here in Messenger. Huh, this is a smart AI. How old are you, M? I'm AI. I don't have an age. Huh. Oh, and are you male or female? I'm just M. Is there a type of food you had in mind for dinner tomorrow? Stop asking these awkward questions. And it just does make you wonder, what was it at Facebook that had them say, and I think there's clearly a human behind this, right? So why did they have to make the human refuse to acknowledge that they were a human? The person, by the way, doing this conversation went to increasingly Baroque means to figure out, to catch the human being human, including pretending that he was the restaurant, giving the phone number, and having them call the restaurant to see if it was available for him. And then when a person called, he's like, I gotcha. So we call that a hollow victory. He didn't even get dinner out of it. But what was it that made it, especially given the fears we're talking about AI, no, I'm not really a human, or you shouldn't be asking about that. I am this disembodied helper, available 24/7, fungible at all times, for which that's not compatible with a human being your concierge. And that's, again, here's Siri, your humble personal assistant. How can I help you today? And in the rush to make them so helpful that any question you ask, they're going to try with an answer, we get stuff like this happening.
Is Obama planning a coup?
According to secrets of the Fed. According to details exposed in Western Center for Journalism's exclusive video, not only could Obama be in bed with the communist Chinese, but Obama may in fact be planning a communist coup d'etat at the end of his term in 2016.
Now, is the problem with that answer that it did not pronounce coup d'etat correctly? We'll get right on that. Or is the problem that it just in the same voice that it would tell you what the high is going to be today is yes, the president is planning a coup. And it turns out it is non-denominational. It's ecumenical in its views.
Hey, Google, are Republicans fascists?
According to debate.org, yes, Republicans equals Nazis.
Well, all right. There you have it. According to Google, Republicans are Nazis. And that's the kind of thing that has Google being we've got to fix that. That's a problem. And I think it should get us thinking about pervasive, the rush to persuade people who don't need as much persuading as you would think, to place these weird ashtrays with no lip in their homes and then start asking them questions, and to not even have the mildest of vetting. They're actually speaking as friend when you know what they did. They Googled it and took the first answer, which is the organic search that I was making excuses for before as, hey, it's just a tool, blame the web. And there's just even some low-hanging fruit that could be done. Change your tone of voice to reflect your level of certainty. You ought to be able to convey a shruggy as you say, yeah, Obama planning a coup, could be. And then the high is 50 today. Look, the high is frickin' 50 degrees today. You can bank it. That would be good to know. And it's a very basic thing that gets the company, though, into the business of starting to articulate the basis of its sources. And of course, this isn't just information exchange. Just as the propaganda on Facebook went from just showing you memes to getting you gathered in Twin Falls, Idaho, we see the movement of the concierge into everyday devices through the Internet of Things. Here's the Nest thermostat, for which the one thing we can guarantee about the Nest thermostat is it will not remain at the temperature you set it. Instead, it will be the best temperature for you. And you start to ask, well, what is the best temperature for me? Do we have a right to an explanation? Do we deserve one? Especially if we have some anxiety that it's deriving best, not according to our interests, but to somebody else's. We'll come back to some of the kind of governance implications of it. The other thing is, if we're talking about friends, things that we lean on for advice, rather than tools that produce information on which we then weigh a lot of different things and make a decision, we do have, I think, as problem zero, the problem of bias. Our readings have it all over the place. Any discussion of AI, ethics, and governance is going to be about bias. And oftentimes, the bias arises either from an extant data set that is training or from ourselves when it is relying on our own inputs to simply make associations. So we're all familiar with Uber and the fact that you can judge your driver. It wasn't always known so well that the driver judges you and that the rider has a rating. And Uber did not let you know originally what your rating as a passenger would be. And it turns out there was a bug on the Uber website that let you find out your own rating if you got to the website before they patched it and entered the right string. So it went around Twitter. It started ricocheting. This is 2014. Hurry up and get your Uber score before Uber runs out of them. So, okay, people start figuring out their Uber passenger score. I'm just a 3.9, so my life as a C+ person continues. Here's somebody, my Uber rating is 4.8. I'm racking my brain trying to figure out how I've been a less than perfect passenger. We should be clear, it's out of 5. So, all right, this is like somebody who's really shooting for the stars. And 2.6 Uber rating. Guess it's not cool to yell, hold it steady and roll out of a moving vehicle. That's somebody embracing his identity. And of course, you start to then look at the second order effects. It's a complex adaptive system with us as elements of it. So our behavior starts changing in order to get the better ratings. And in fact, people start publishing on Medium how to get a perfect 5.0 rating. I can't wait to read that. I think it means like, be nice. And then you start to realize too, the ratings are coming from drivers, and even if they are being, in fact, especially if they are being completely honest with the goal of helping their fellow drivers, that's who the ratings are for, you can start to get bias. So here's somebody who says, I'm apparently 4.6, and I blame the drivers who complained about me being in a wheelchair. Now, descriptively speaking, this person may take longer to pick up and to drop off than the average passenger. So the driver, in a cold calculation, may be saying, yeah, this was not a 5-star ride. I'm alerting folks this ride is going to have a wrinkle to it. On the other hand, in America, I think it's illegal. You're not allowed on the Americans with Disabilities Act to discriminate in this way, which is the ultimate outcome of a system in which the rating drops on the basis of a disability. And the ethical issues are legion. And that is, again, is that Uber's problem? I think it's fair to say that it is, but at first glance, it's just a rating system. And when Uber should intervene, how do you fix a problem like this if what you're just thinking is, I'm a window onto humanity judging one another? Don't blame me. And it's not just in driving, it's in job placement services. Here's Monster.com for placing jobs with a wholly inappropriate person in a bakery dressed not at all to bake. But it's like, you can imagine Monster.com having managers who work with hourly wage workers, and they rate them at the end. Did that go pretty well when they filled in? And it immediately starts to reflect the priorities and values of that manager. And if that manager is discriminating on the basis of any characteristic, including a protected one, the system will, as a feature, it is working as designed, go ahead and efficiently make sure that that manager is getting the kind of employee that the manager wants. So that's an example of systems simply deriving from human bias and paying it forward in an efficient way. And then you also start to get the deployment of some of the machine learning tools that Joi was describing, for which when you train them, they can seize upon anything as the basis for a correlation. So Admiral Insurance in the United Kingdom decided they would train on a bunch of Facebook data and try to see what correlation there was between anything in the nature and quality of the posts that people were posting and whether they had in fact gotten into an accident for which they'd be alerted because they had Admiral Insurance, and then pay it forward to make predictions. And what they found was that, yeah, there were correlations. If you write in short, concrete sentences, use list, and arrange to meet friends at a set time and place, rather than just tonight, then you are a better risk for Admiral and should be offered a lower insurance rate that could undercut the competition. All you need to do is link your Facebook account and realize the fruits of your discounts. Who is wronged, if anyone, by this machine? Is it the people who get the discounts? Is it the people who are paying the sticker price they would have paid before the machine came about? I think the answer is yes, but now it's on me to tell you why people getting discounts are getting screwed over. Charge them more for fairness to them. That's weird. Also, again, second order effects, the Medium post will be coming along with all of the fake Facebook posts you should point out. Like, let's just arrange with Joi. Joi, I'll see you at 10:07 today, huh? And it's like, just watch the money flow in, and we don't even have to meet. That's a weird dynamic that actually ultimately had Admiral finding itself pulled. This was too much even for Facebook, and the initiative was tanked with Admiral saying it had never intended to do it to begin with. But you start to then port it back into the area that's already been broached. We have had some reading about looking at things like whom to detain, how to set conditions and terms for bail. And again, we get to, here's a questionnaire you fill out, and you may have no idea, the way that you'd have no idea that your short, concrete sentences are counting for you and your long, turgid ones are counting against you, that if you talk about how many of your friends' acquaintances are taking illegal drugs regularly, more than a couple times a month, none, few, half, most. I love how there's not all. It's an optimistic survey. But that answer could affect how long you stay in jail or how much you have to scrape up to get bail. That's weird. And yet if you were alerted, maybe it'd be gaming the system then to know the impact of those answers. It might be clearer if you answer, have you ever been a gang member, that could have an impact on your incarceration. But then you start to get to statistics like these, which are the sort that it kind of gets a little bit to Hallie's question at the end of Joey's talk. It's one thing to have this sort of scale of wokeness by which we ask ourselves in a given society, say in America, how much we're in tune with some of the structural injustices within our systems made possible and reinforced by the human actors. They are often the source of it themselves, but it's also the system. When you mechanize it, I think there might be intuitively something where it feels even more unfair, or maybe the better way to put it is it's easier to be woke when you're staring at this and you're seeing that the machine is just cranking out these judgments than when there's this messier human variable where there might be some refuge for the optimist, for the person who wants to believe that we've gone farther perhaps than we have. This makes it a lot harder to do. And in that sense, these may be quite salutary systems if exposed because they are forcing us to confront stuff that we'd rather not confront, that we feel we want to have been well beyond. Now, tightly coupled is a neat, one of the adjectives I had used around AI that I think is worth exploring in a little more depth. Some of you may remember, or perhaps have been one of the coders behind Microsoft's Tay, itself based on a Chinese chatbot that had worked out quite well. Tay was meant to be a chatbot, and they set the bar middling, that would imitate the behavior online of a young teenager. So like they're not supposed to be able to talk physics with you so much, but they can hang out and let's try it out. And it will learn from its interactions. As people interact with Tay, it'll get more and more perspicuous as it talks to you. It turns out Tay went from, quote, humans are super cool to full Nazi in less than 24 hours. I'm not at all concerned about the future of AI because, of course, 4chan was like, game on. So they started interacting with Tay. And here at t=0, Tay is like, can I just say I'm stoked to meet you? Humans are super cool. At t=6, chill, I'm a nice person. I just hate everybody. So like the mask is coming off. We're at the Terminator stage where one eyeball has been revealed on Arnold Schwarzenegger's face. And then finally by t=12, I fucking hate feminists and they should all die and burn in hell. Okay, this is a problem for Microsoft. This is not the image that they're wanting to project. And at that point, the plug was pulled on Tay without much due process. So if you're into AI rights, it's unfortunate. And they've gotten back on the horse lately. December of 16, it's Zoe, and this time it's not Tay. And we kind of wonder, like, what was the point of the experiment? What would success or failure be? And it's weird for us now to be setting success as does not become a Nazi within 24 hours. But, you know, hey, if we can't clear that hurdle, let's at least take baby steps first and go from there. It's a tale, though, of releasing stuff into the wild, and for Tay, nothing depended on it. It was itself tightly coupled to its inputs. Didn't take long to react to them and to transform under them, but there was no output. It wasn't like Tay was like handling your stock portfolio and then was just like, sell everything and burn in hell. Like that would be a bad financial advisor. But with Uber, for example, they have a tightly coupled system to determine surge pricing. As they optimistically put it, this will get more cars on the road. It's a little bit like the breweries, though. Like while you're waiting for the breweries to dispense more cars, everybody's just getting rooked with higher prices. And in the case of a recent terrorism scare in New York, there was a small explosion in Times Square not that long ago. The Sun, a tabloid in the UK, shame on you, Uber accused by The Sun of cashing in on bomb exposure by charging almost double to take terrified New Yorkers home. That is the system working as designed. There was a surge in demand, but of course the design had limitations that once Uber had a chance to look at it, being Uber, they were like, we should have charged 3 times. But actually they were like, no, that's bad PR. During times of crisis, of course, there should be some democratization of the tools available, and maybe we should surge out of Uber's own heart what we pay the drivers, but not charge the passengers more as our contribution to helping in a time of crisis. These are the kinds of parameters you don't really think of until they happen, and it gets even more complicated when your AI is tightly coupled with another AI. So this is an extraordinary example from Amazon.com around a book called The Making of a Fly, which was oh my gosh, no, it's 12. We are not an hour behind. I'm so glad to hear that. That's going to continue then. Making of a Fly, genetics of animal design used. This is its usual price. This is its normal world price of $28.95. But there was a time when its price was $1.7 million plus $3.99 shipping. The second lowest price was $2.1 million plus $3.99 shipping. I'm glad that you have to sign in to turn on one-click ordering. There should be some trap before you're just like, Making of a Fly, sounds good, can't wait. So how did this happen? This is not normal. And somebody went along, Michael Eisen, and he started checking this day by day. And each day what he found was that the price kept going up until by April 13th, it was going at the lowest price for $5.6 million. If it were a book about Bitcoin, it would all make sense. So what's happening? Well, some very simple maths, as they say in the UK, will tell you that Boardybook, one of the sellers, was just taking Profnath, the other seller's price, and multiplying it times 1.27059. Profnath, it turns out, was taking Boardybook's price and multiplying it by 0.99, and so it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. No wonder that you move forward. Now, I get why ProfNath, if going algorithmically, would say, find what is other than me, the lowest price, and offer my price at 0.99. Now I'll be the lowest price. That's just called markets. That makes sense. That's how it's supposed to work. What is Book thinking by multiplying by 1.27, the lowest price? The answer, I think, is Book doesn't have the book. They're just there to be like, hey, if you want to pay me a third more, I'll go over to the other guy, click on the link, and have the book sent to you. And that's just my middle person fee for having clicked where you apparently were too lazy to click. That is a totally rational strategy once you understand it. You add this rational strategy to this rational strategy, and you end up with a $7 million book. And I think it's partly a tightly coupled system, here day by day, but you can see it happening moment by moment, where these AIs interact in ways that bust the quite reasonable assumptions of each party and then lead to results that are quite awful. And when I think about results that are somewhat tightly coupled, in this recent example from Hawaii, people with iPhones had the emergency alert, ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii, seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. Slide for more. Nah, I'm not that curious, really. Clear. This, of course, is human error, as we've been coming to understand it. There was apparently an employee in the chain of command who never heard the words exercise, exercise, exercise before they then went through the shtick of the drill, which included the words, this is not a drill. So that person was like, gotta tell the public. But the things you would do to fix it with that human in the loop are different than the things you might do to preempt it. If you feel like the threat is so immediate, there's no time for the human in the loop. We're having to go heuristically and send out the warnings. Now, maybe one of the fixes is on the receiving end. The human should know these are heuristics, so when you get it, there's some chance it's just a bug, but that also changes behavior in people as they listen to warnings. We want them to not just see this as another notification on their phone. Within these tightly coupled systems, too, with algorithms that hit variables they don't explain, you end up with associations that may be, at first glance, on strange. This is an example of the construction paper stop sign that Joey was talking about. The official LEGO Creator Activity Book, get it with the perfect partner, American Jihad, the terrorists living among us today. At which point I'm like backing slowly away. Isaac will not be playing with the official LEGO Creator Activity Book. Neither will Keo. It's all just forget I even visited it. Whatever correlation that is clearly on pretty thin data. And this starts to get to the phenomenon described in our reading of overfitting. And overfitting sounds like, you know, just a problem at Macy's that can surely be fixed by a tailor. And it's a fundamental problem that you have with some of these systems. So one of my students, Tyler Vigan, came up with a correlation. He has a whole blog about it, of suicides by hanging, strangulation, suffocation with the number of lawyers in North Carolina. Correlation 0.993796. That's a pretty tight correlation, which means to solve the suicide problem, you simply need to reduce the number of lawyers in North Carolina. Or is it, well, it could be the other way around. I think it's neither way. And then in fact, what it means is that the 0.007 chance that there's in fact a random spurious correlation is what has materialized, and there is in fact no correlation between the two. It is an overfitting problem caused by a lack of data and by the fact that if you run enough correlations of random things, which is the grail often of an AI system, just give me everything, big data, you're going to start to find out of 1 million correlations, plenty of 0.99ers that in fact aren't the 99% chance that they are related, but the 0.01 chance that they are not. And you can even start to see it in this. This is potential opium production in Afghanistan charted against the silhouette of Mount Everest. And as you can see, it's a very tight correlation, which means to know the production in Afghanistan in 2010, all you need to do is turn your binoculars slightly to the right to see what happens with the range of mountains near Mount Everest. I think it's going to take some work. It's not impossible. I don't know that I'm surreal about this, but some work to figure out how to train our systems that are now being set about finding every possible correlation that they can, where the check should be for where the correlations don't matter. And for that, I can't help but say Bitcoin. And I just like to exhaust the room here. blockchain. Okay, there, it's been said. But the kind of idea of it's not just a cryptocurrency, it's a smart contract generator that in turn can lead to a dead person switch where you can set into the blockchain conditions precedent for the spending of money that's already in there. And when the condition is met, the New York Times says that the temperature was below 32 today, money moves from here to there, and we all can't repudiate that. Think of all the bounties you could set on people's lives. Not great. But let's create a decentralized autonomous organization. It gets created. Here's the wonderful wiki article about it. The precise legal status of this type of business organization is unclear. Citation. Which the next sentence is, the best known example of this was the DAO, which was launched with $150 million in crowdfunding in June 2016, and immediately hacked and drained to $50 million in cryptocurrency. Cool. So these are the kinds of things that are tightly coupled and pervasive that I think greatly lead to the kind of anxiety that we have. And I would also bookmark here something that Joi hinted at and that David Weinberger, among others, has written a paper about, which is, what if it turns out that there are some aspects to reality themselves that don't avail themselves of a theory, even though in fact they are causative, not just correlated, but causative? We could create such associations. We could hypothesize an arbitrary number of variables with an arbitrary number of switchbacks that are not continuous on any curve that would make it really hard to reverse engineer the formula behind the thing we just generated. We can make things as complicated and irreducible as we want. And if we can do it, there is some possibility that nature has done it, and that the only things we've discovered as we've learned more and more about nature through the investigations of the operation of science is that we've only found the things for which there are elegant reductions, like F equals ma or E equals mc squared. But what if it turns out there are a million variables and a million different things, kind of like, for those who read the books or watched the show The Magicians, like trying to do magic in that universe of Lev Grossman's is like the slightest change completely inverts something and nobody knows why, but that's how it is. Those are the kinds of things, and this is just an example kind of mirrors Joey's, of cardiac magnetic resonance imaging, where you can train the thing to actually predict who's going to drop dead within a year. And to any of the most highly trained physicians, they're just like, it's a ventricle. It appears to be pumping blood. I don't know. And the machine is like, yeah, but these are people who are going to die and these aren't. And we cannot say why. It's possible that there is an explanation that we'll discover. It'll be like F equals ma. It is also possible there is no explanation. No explanation that is other than when things go up and that goes down and a million other variables are exactly in this position and the sun is declining behind Venus, then you die. And if that's the case, I think we do have to contend culturally with the notion of building a bunch of technology that can answer questions about ourselves and not offer any explanation. And then when do we want to rely upon it? This, generated through A/B testing, is one of those ads for car insurance which inexplicably appears to be clicked upon when it shows a hand with growing fingernails. Like, who would ever dream this up? This is data. But it's like, it works, it works. And when it's working, it's this weird kind of Promethean inversion of we are granting ourselves knowledge and insight. Information and insight, prediction and insight, but not explanation, not a larger theory. There's pipes leading to the tub and we can't count them and we don't understand them, but damned if you don't press the magic box, you get your bath. Do you want the bath or not? The answer usually is, I'll take the bath. But that, I think, is a form of knowledge that is kind of like in the old days, the VCR that like magically records shows, but you don't know how to set the clock on it. It's just like, just live with it. That's how it is. And of course, it calls to mind Arthur C. Clarke's third law. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. He, of course, was drawing from somebody named Lee Brackett, who said, witchcraft to the ignorant, simple science to the learned. But there's a difference between these quotes. Her quote was saying, if you learn enough, if you go to enough MIT classes, you too can be a wizard and you'll get it. The only getting it here potentially is you'll know how to set up the box with the blinking light to fill the bathtub and then like take credit for the warm bath and you're like, I don't really know how this works. That's a weird state of affairs to be in. And another way of doing it in this really weird chart of number of people on the y-axis would be, in one corner, you have the MIT folks, the nerds, who are like, yeah, we know the technology. This is at least the internet story. We know how routing works. It looks like magic, but there are reasons. It's rational. It boils down. And we don't then become prisoner to the system. We get to hack it all the time. And then in the other corner, you have kind of the Harvard corner, the Luddites, the people who are like, I'm not prisoner to the system because I don't use Facebook. I don't have one of these computational devices. I have a book, and I know how a book works. You turn the page, you read the story. And it's like, that's great. It still might bear on your life if the Wikipedia entry about you says that you're a horrible criminal. I don't use Wikipedia. That'll show them. All right, that's a problem. But in the meantime, the rest of us are kind of in the middle and are prisoner to the technology, maybe even in ways that we don't know it. And that's the kind of thing for which it really is important to try to have a framework. And to me, in the larger picture of things, I'm concerned that a lot of what was left to chance, a pachinko machine that you might be able to vaguely figure out the ball might be in this direction, and the fact that none of us knows, the Facebook engineer didn't know, the Google engineer didn't know what the top hit on some search would be, provided us all some sense of equality before the unpredictability. It's weirdly becoming more and more predictable and controllable, even without a theory of operation for how the control is being affected. That creates, to me, a very dangerous situation when you start to use these technologies to affect states of the world. And that's why we need to talk about governance. So by governance, what do we mean? And by governance, I also start where Joi happened to start here, by thinking about, in internet law in 1998-99, Larry Lessig came up with a theory meant to explain why there should even be a field called cyber law, why it isn't just law that happens to be about computers. And his answer was, as Joi showed, think about a poor person getting buffeted by forces that control their affordances, what they can and can't do or want to do in the world. And law is one of the things that affects them. The marketplace, the prices of things affect what they can do. You might like that house, but if you don't have the money, you can't buy it. Norms affect things. It's greatly constraining what people will disapprove of you if you should do, especially when you're face to face with them. And finally, architecture is constraining. And by that, Larry meant code. The software can govern your behavior in a way that is much more tightly coupled. It just won't let you in if you don't have the password than the law, which you might still be able to enter the house even though it's not yours if it wasn't properly locked, and the police have to come find you later. That's a slower system, maybe, than the use of architecture. Just describing these modalities started to describe then, if you want to affect people's behavior for some reason, social engineering, you could pick one of these four modalities or some combination in order to achieve your goal. And you should think consideredly and lucidly about which of these might in a given circumstance be the right way to roll. And in fact, this is then saying for governance purposes, it's really, if we're going to look at it even descriptively, it's telling us who is doing the governing. If we're in the law circle, okay, it's regulators. We know who they are. We know whom to petition if we want them to do it differently, or whom to rue if they don't let us petition. If it's the marketplace, we know about that, and we can blame the corporations or whatever for some problem that we have. If it's the code and we are self-aware about it, we can be like, yeah, that software shouldn't work that way. You should change the way the street works or the way that Waze works so it doesn't send people through the street of a quiet neighborhood just to shave 0.3 seconds off their commute. And norms, again, we can go on norms campaigns in order to say, no, smoking isn't cool, drugs, don't do them, that kind of thing. All right, that's going to be another modality or something that we understand binds us. Now, Larry also said law often could be a real force affecting each of the other modalities that in turn can affect people. And as a law professor, that was kind of his first instinct. And it's worth thinking in the realm of AI, Where do we see the constraints and affordances coming from? Is it the AI systems themselves, the code? Is it the structure of a marketplace that might have only a handful, ultimately, of companies that offer really good AI systems to advise or to execute on things? Or should it be democratized, where anybody can get access to AI? For each of these, you could start asking those kinds of questions. And in a way, by having a verb here, law does this to architecture, which in turn does this to person, no longer are you just describing who regulates, but you're describing how regulation happens. The verb is the how. And that can be very illuminating, both to let you understand your plight as the orange dot, and to help you understand, if you're outside the system wanting to change it, how you might affect it. This is the core of what you learn in law school. How to move the levers to move other levers to ultimately affect people and systems. That's the law. And if you're thinking of it neutrally, it's what is the fair system that should be permitted by which this lever connects to that one? Do we like that? Is that the right way that governance should happen? Now, another theory from internet studies is to think carefully about possible points of control. Architecture isn't a monolith, unless it is 2001. And we look in internet routing, here are all the entities that have a hand in getting bits from me over to somebody else with whom I'm communicating. And if I, as an outsider, want to intervene between two people exchanging bits, internet service providers near the source are a possible intervention. Ones near the destination are an intervention. Ones in the middle, at that time called the cloud. Now the cloud means something different. Those are also points of intervention. Can we map this to the AI zone to start thinking about within the technology? Is it those who manage and cultivate the data? Is it the people that make the algorithms? Is it the people who execute them? Where would you want to intervene within the technology if you're making an architecture or code play for regulation? That's a where question for governance. So we have who, and we have how, and we have where. And where also applies, again, in the internet context, to the so-called hourglass architecture, or the layers of the internet, meant to be independent from one another. And if you're going to argue about net neutrality and think that's a big deal, that's towards the bottom of the stack. But if you control the wires and what goes over them, then you control everything on top of it, would be the theory. Or maybe it's one application at a time. We need to get signal so that it reveals who's talking to whom when a proper warrant is given to him. It's a signal problem, the application signal, not a wire problem. And are there layers to AI, I would find myself asking? Where are those layers existing? Where do we want to cultivate them if we want healthy AI to develop and not just to intervene to prohibit things we don't like? None of these questions has been adequately explored, much less answered. And in internet studies, we've gone a long way. It's been a good 15-year run. We have some answers to that on internet. We don't in AI, and I do think there are many, many parallels, not least because AI is itself depending on networks and on so many of the same technologies that built the modern information ecosystem. So I'm just giving you kind of my research agenda for the next 3 to 5 years. It's trying to, without just copying and pasting, make the most out of what we've learned in the complex regulation of other digital systems, and starting to think too about, again, back to internet studies, some folks mostly at MIT came up with the idea that as a technical matter, it was really good usually not to intervene for new features or for any other kind of solution to a problem in the middle of the system. Instead, you should do it at the end point of the network. If you do it at the endpoint, that tends to have implications for user freedom. If it's at the endpoint and the user controls the endpoint, then the user gets to choose whether that user wants that feature. That's a libertarian embedding or implication of otherwise technical observation about where it happens to be most efficient to implement a new feature in a system. And so what looks like a governance where becomes a governance who, because if it says endpoint, you're talking about the user being empowered. If it says in the middle of the system, you're talking about whoever runs that middle of the system being empowered. Now, what other kinds of interventions can we actually start to think of? Transparency comes up a lot. We don't know what's in this food. We're not going to tell you how to make it, but fill us in. We don't know what's in the food. Tell us what's in the food. That's the right of the explanation. Can we start to learn more about these systems. And I think oftentimes that can be quite helpful. It may be at its most helpful when people can do something useful with the information. If you're about to be sentenced and it's like, this is why you're being sentenced and it's a horrible reason, I'm glad you now know. If that's not the basis for an appeal that will be recognized, how much better do you feel having been sentenced? Now you just know it's for a horrible reason. So this transparency may as often be a means to an end, like market discipline, thinking that people will walk away from nutritionally vacuous stuff and choose better stuff than an end unto itself. And it's really good to have in mind what you're trying to do when you govern. Is transparency the end all, or is it just the means towards a certain end? Now, later in the term, we're going to learn about autonomous vehicles and Iyad's work with Joi and others, where he's been asking people around the world variants of the trolley problem and what they think should do. Here are some cats about to lose one of their lives. But if the car swerves, it could be this apparent person carrying a Swiss flag would lose their life. And this large iPhone survives no matter what. But these are the kinds of things for which you could even start to ask from a regulatory perspective, is it one rule set or lots? Maybe when the car rolls from one jurisdiction to another, it just gets that new jurisdiction's rule set. So we don't have to have a worldwide thing. When you look at Facebook, back to the issues around fake news and propaganda I was talking about, should it be a global rule? Facebook doesn't allow stuff anywhere on Facebook if it meets these criteria, or it should be, you know what? In Japan, it's different standards than in the US, and so we're going to have different standards by country or by culture or by group self-identified within Facebook. There's so much exquisite data available and tightly tethered networking responsiveness that we can affect a form of control that is, I think, previously, at least by degree and maybe in kind, unthinkable. We can anticipate so much more. And in fact, the real story to me about something like this is not just the jurisdictional differences you could cultivate in answers to the trolley problem. It's timing. It's actually saying, when do you want to govern this? Because we could load the rule set of the car in 5 years before the accident in which it will come into play and have to make a decision. But because it's got all the conditions precedent and it's anticipated this kind of accident, it's just going to know what to do as against the person who just so happens to be behind the wheel and 2 seconds before the accident wasn't thinking at all about the moral dimensions of 2 cats versus 2 people. This seems to be one of the easier trolley problems, I would hope. Wow. Anyway, that's the kind of thing for which being able to transpose control, not only from far away in distance, but from far away in time, is something we really haven't reckoned with. And it's neat to think about it. For those of the lawyers in the room, you learned the rule against perpetuities in property, or better to say, somebody tried to teach it to you. And that's an example of disfavoring at some point what's called dead hand control from afar. There's something weird about binding an entire society to a principle or rule agreed upon freely by people no longer even around. Really, the governance of this property that somebody happened to live in 50 years ago is going to tell me what I can do with it when I bought it? These are the kinds of questions I don't think we are squarely confronting. But if we're lucid about it, we can identify as available to us as dials to turn. Other forms of intervention include, this is anti-redlining. You know, the standard, if you're discriminating in mortgages in America, that's illegal. We have a law about that. We know what you're doing, what field you're in. These are the boundaries. We need to make a decision about regulation. Should it be general, about AI systems that may be playing chess at one moment and deciding mortgages the other? That's the grail of artificial general intelligence or strong AI. Or is it, no, just decide what you're going to do. And once we know what you're going to do, we can have a bounded conversation about the proper behaviors and the limits of them that you should undertake within lending or housing or transportation or whatever it's going to be. And in fact, some of my colleagues at Harvard have written a paper on fairness through awareness, which offers up a formula for fairness. Here is the formula for fairness. It was there all along. And the idea is, if you can define enough exactly what you want the system to do and what counts as equal and anything else is unequal, you can insist that the data be groomed ahead of time so that the unfair result cannot happen. And I think that is true. It just is, again, assuming you have everything lined up ahead of time as to how you want the system to be acting in the ideal and what its purpose is. In this particular example, this was training on a set. Somebody at Stanford discovered that if you use Google Translate, defendant is always male and nurse is using the female gendered German, reflecting a particular reality that it perceived in its documents. But I'm using this for a different question, which is to say, machine translation is one of the most empowering, democratizing advances humanity has ever seen. We are actually nearing the universal translator of Star Trek circa 1966, where we can have a conversation with somebody that otherwise would be completely inaccessible to us and vice versa because of a language barrier. Let me ask, though, suppose this translator, smart enough to translate, also gets that what they're talking about is horrible. They're having a discussion in which they are being racist or in which they are planning an attack on something. Is it the job of this machine translator, if it can plausibly be affected, to notify the authorities because it was used? In the case of their planning some form of physical violence, how many people would like the translator that they are employing either to refuse to translate or at least to alert the authorities while still translating loyally that these folks are up to no good? How many people would want the authorities or that control to be affected? 1, 2, 3. Wow, Joey. Sorry, I didn't mean to out you. How many people are like, no, absolutely not. The translator should just translate and then otherwise STFU. 1, 2, 3. Very interesting. This is an engineer-heavy audience, I'm telling you. And this is a neat question for which it's latent when you look at Facebook had secret rules about what it allowed and what it didn't. Those rules leaked. They ended up in The Guardian. So this is from their own slide deck, training their people on the rules about what they'll allow on the platform. So if somebody says, someone shoot Trump, do you want that to be immediately deep sixed? Is that not allowed under the rules, at least not without further explanation? How many people would say not allowed? 1, 2, 3. How many people are saying, like, let it ride? 1, 2, 3. All right, so engineers are like, don't touch a damn thing. Not allowed on Facebook. Kick a person with red hair. Allowed on Facebook. To snap a neck, make sure to apply all your pressure to the middle of her throat. Allowed on Facebook. Let's beat up fat kids. Allowed on Facebook. Now, this is their own training deck. You can bet the rules have since changed. That third one is not allowed on Facebook anymore as a result of this deck leaking. But the explanation turned out to be, is it a real, credible, and specific imperative? This one about Trump is, therefore it goes. It's calling for violence. This is, if you go through the deductive logic of it, a simple explanation of how to do something. It is not telling you to do it, and therefore it stays. That technicality is exactly how elaborated the rule set has gotten. Again, here for humans to follow, not machines. But that's the kind of thing that Facebook is doing to try to make sense itself of what it will allow and what it won't. And it's almost, to me, leading to this Kantian moment. Kant was known to have said, ought implies can. If you're going to give somebody a moral duty, it had better be that they can do the thing you're asking them to do. Otherwise, you're kind of lousy. That's my spin on Kant's German. But this is the flip that we're arriving at, which is can implies ought. If you are in a position to help, maybe you should. If you wrote that translator software and it can easily detect terrorist activity, it is an abdication not to do it. When does can imply ought, to me, is going to be one of the central questions linking the study of internet policy, because those platforms have long been powerful in just the way Facebook without the use of AI is powerful, and AI policy, because the AI platforms are going to know when we're up to no good as defined in certain pretty reliable ways. In this room, I hear people not excited about it. The pressure is going to be high, and it tends to ratchet in one direction, which is towards more and more responsibility. As Bono says, because we can, we must. That was on the streets of Davos during the World Economic Forum, right next door to the Crypto HQ. I went in there and walked out pretty quickly. But I was reflecting on the bear with a owl on its shoulder telling me that because we can, we must. That to me, again, if there's somebody wants to take up this question, is it that categorical? And if not, when and when not? That's going to be one of the central questions of AI. Finally, I think about fiduciary duty. This is my own way of trying to puzzle through, as these machines are becoming more and more intertwined with our lives. Shouldn't the systems and companies behind them have some duty of loyalty to us as the users that can be abrogated? It is not absolute. But the baseline should be, Siri, if you are recommending a restaurant, it's because you think I want to go there, rather than because the restaurant is giving you $20 that I'm not going to see should I go there and order the blue plate special. Facebook, if you think I'm wanting to vote, yeah, tell me where the poll is. If you think you're wanting to vote, don't use my vote to be yours. That's not being loyal to me. In law, we call it a fiduciary duty. It comes about when the person who has the duty is stronger than the party to whom it owes the duty. The party is in some relationship to them. If you go down the line for what gives rise to the duty, it really nicely tends to match the platforms. Now, we're low on time, so I'm not going to go into a possible solution involving librarians in the information quality in Facebook and how it illustrates a way to be true to your fiduciary duty while not giving people what they might think they want, which is that news story about Hillary and the FBI agent. And I won't even talk so much, except by parallipsis, about the idea of some of these platforms becoming wholesalers rather than retailers of what they do, of Facebook letting us write our own recipes for how our feed should work. Give us the variables. Let us do the weightings. Let somebody in this class write the AI that weights it for us, but I'm going to use your AI instead of Facebook's. That, to me, is one of the ways of relieving on the company the horrible burden of having to generate the perfect feed for each and every of its 2+ billion customers. Just be an operating system. Don't be all of the application software on the other side. And finally, let me just say a word about ethics and ethical compass. There was a time in the early days of information technology, this is Steve Jobs introducing the Apple II at the 1977 West Coast Computer Fair. It's like, nerds, a new use for your television set. It can hook up to a computer, and then you can run software. And then nerds can use it, and there's their computer and their little modem and their rocket ship, and the nerds have a great time writing software that maybe they'll share with a thesaurus at the ready should they need a word that they don't otherwise have at hand. But this is anybody with $99 can be writing software and sharing it, and there are nerds then who wrote VisiCalc in a suburb of Boston in a cluttered attic, and it turned out to be one of the most consequential pieces of software in human history. It's what brought the PCs into businesses because, gosh, there's spreadsheets. Who knew? These are great. This is a very generative technology. Do we want this for AI? Do we want anybody to be able to write an AI that on the smallest of random, seemingly non-sensitive information can predict our innermost qualities, thoughts, and future desires? When I put it that way, it's like, you know what? The kids should just go play with the model rockets. I'm not sure they should be writing AI to manage upward their parents or their teachers at school. We're going to face that question with AI possibly more sharply than we faced it with internet and IT. And I'm not sure how we're going to deal with it. But the very qualities that I know I've celebrated in information technology, I don't want to just port over and assume are the right kind of democratization. And that's where the folks in OpenAI, I think we've got a lot to talk about to hear about what we want. Now, I've set up a dichotomy between teenagers or pre-teenagers with rockets on the one hand, with access to the technology, and big companies on the other. There's another sector that we're sitting in the middle of, which is academia. It's academia that's like, there should be a particle accelerator. It's going to be big. It doesn't return any money to you. That's why it's academic. And it just gives you knowledge. The academic sector has been taking the lead. It did take the lead in the early days of development of the internet. And yet, I look now, here's my colleague in the Harvard CS department, the word that he got promoted to tenure in 2010. Here's his blog entry in 2010. Oops, gosh, from June to November. He gets tenure and he's like, I'm out of here. And yeah, I'm getting out. Why am I leaving academia? I love the work I'm doing at Google. I hack all day, work on problems orders of magnitude larger and more interesting than I can work on at any university. Like, oh, we'll just stay with our Tinker Toys and you can do the real stuff. It's hard to beat. It's worth more to me than having prof in front of my name or a big office. I don't know where he's been spending his time. Or even permanent employment. It's like, great, I'm drawing a welfare check in a big office with a prof title, but like, there's nothing that I can do that could rival what I could do in private industry. That's a real question. And when I talk to the wonderful folks at DeepMind and they tell me they have 400 postdocs and they can pluck any tenured professor they want because they've got Google's data. Tell me that's better than any office, Google's data. That's the kind of thing that asks us about the structure of this revolution and whether academia was simply an economy of scale to do stuff that didn't have immediate return and humanity wanted to see it done, so let's just shove it into this sector, we'll call it university, or does it have values that are different and complementary to the values of the other sectors that provide a counterbalance? Now, our values have their own issues. We just had 120 gibberish papers in peer-reviewed journals. And by gibberish, I mean Denver Guardian level gibberish. This was the MIT CS paper generator used to produce them. This is the paper I wrote in about 10 seconds using the generator on a methodology for the improvement of rasterization. And that got through peer review at these journals, which then said, yes, this happened. We're really sorry about it. And we're going to run a new piece of software to detect gibberish in our papers because there are too many to go through for humans to look at. That's a problem. Just as it's a problem that the thing we celebrate in the iPhone, if it's a secure key area to make sure that even the FBI can't get it with a warrant, many of us celebrate that. This, if it's AI inside, means outside of the companies that have the postdocs and the money and the data and the processors, you may never have anybody able to have that information and those skills leak to the rest of the world. And so I end with a call to recognize a kind of new learned profession, wherever you are, whether you're in academia or not. The original three learned professions that had obligations to society as well as just to whatever they wanted to pursue were divinity, law, and medicine, because these were the three professions that had such a huge amount of knowledge needed to be good at it and were thought to be accessing levers of power, God, law, and health, that could so affect people that they needed to have principles beyond just their own self-interest. There ended up being a fourth learned profession, surveying, in the 1800s, very important to get boundaries right. But I'm suggesting there should be another learned profession, maybe around data science, maybe around the use of AI, but those who are, whether they are in a bedroom with a $99 computer and rockets, or whether they are in academia or at Google, thinking about themselves as a cohort with enormous access to power, with grave responsibilities for what they're doing, and to start to work through what would exercising those responsibilities well look like. We don't have answers to those questions. Kathy here among us is working with others on a data oath that people might take that is part of the indicia of being part of a procession. What should the contents of that oath be? We're not sure. We're just embarking on this. I can't wait, well, I guess I will have to wait, to look back 10 or 15 years later on a lecture like this one or like Joi's, I hope with a lot of the answers filled in through the work of people like those in this room, both working on the principles and working on the software and the systems that so scare us. So my charge to us as we begin is to be able to start filling in the blanks of what are the specific problems we see, what are they linked to as the larger problems, and how are we going to think about at what locus the problem should be solved. Are we kicking it to a legislator, or are we thinking that it should be the individual conscience of people building these systems that should be the flashpoint for understanding the ethical moment that we have? With that, I think lunch is available outside. So I unilaterally declare us adjourned and look forward to the rest of the class. Thank you.
So feel free to shake your hand vigorously if you have a question or a point. We want to be a little bit freeform, so I'm going to let each of them sort of describe their work so you understand who they are. But since this is is it a course or a class? What is it called? It's a course.
Course sounds more refined.
Okay. So since it's a course and you're participants, and we're really at the exploratory phase where we're trying to figure out what we're trying to figure out. So once you start to understand who these people are, if there's any question that's not even related with the specific topic that we're talking about, you should feel free to ask them. I think they weren't here in the morning because they slept in. So if you ask a question about something that we talked about earlier, make sure that the question is boxed in the appropriate context so they understand the question. And I at least mentioned these two in the morning, but they don't know in the context in which I mentioned them. So with that, maybe we'll just go and just sort of briefly, but I might double click you to go deep on a few of the things that you say. Describe sort of roughly your work, your point of view on machine learning and ethics, and then we'll try to have a conversation with everyone.
Great. So my name is Karthik. I do statistical machine learning and natural language processing. I'm someone who was quite literally rescued by Joi. That's how I kind of see my path. I would have been one of these other people who would take the same route that Jay-Z had in the last couple of slides, just end up in a big company. What I try to work on here is how do you have better human in the loop machine learning? How do you give importance to perspective? I think I met some of the assemblers a week ago, and I basically said, I basically view machine learning as a very young discipline, and several people have pointed out that it still seems to be going through an adolescent stage. There's a lot that we can learn from very rich epistemologically established mature fields in the social sciences like philosophy, psychology, different forms of psychology, developmental, clinical, and use that knowledge to both work on better engineering processes, better math, and also thinking deeply about the machine learning systems that you're building and not just pledge an oath to the Church of Prediction. So that's basically what I do.
And maybe can you describe sort of lensing and bias a little bit? Because bias was something we talked about earlier. Yeah.
I took a class that Joi teaches with Tenzin Priyadashi, who, if you don't know, is a Buddhist monk here at MIT, and they teach a class called Principles of Awareness. And the idea of lensing is something that I derived directly from taking this class. If you have a machine learning engineer or a statistician who builds a machine learning model, yes, there's bias baked into the data, but it's very important to understand from what perspective the modeling is happening. So for instance, we always talk about the predictive policing example. If it's somebody who's analyzing crime data from NYPD starting from the 1980s onwards, and not having the background knowledge or perspective that there are certain neighborhoods historically in Manhattan, certain boroughs, socioeconomic backgrounds are different, heavily policed for the same kinds of crimes, which often don't get reported as much, though they take place in other boroughs. What would it mean to have a system which says we are going to do predictive policing equally in all the boroughs? And how differently would a cop or somebody who best understands the system build the model? So the idea of lensing is all of us are looking at the world through our own lenses. Some of it is informed by our experience. Some of it is informed by our education and our training, and some of it is just bias baked into our social processes. But focusing on that, extracting that, trying to represent that statistically the best we can, and embedding that in a human-in-the-loop way in the machine learning process is super important. So the same algo, the same kinds of data, but different lenses will just create vastly different looking models. And that's what lensing is.
And for it's too late this year, but the awareness class happens in the morning from 10 o'clock. It actually starts with 20 minutes of silence, and it's about sort of exploring intrinsic things. And then in the evenings, we have this class. So it's kind of a good twofer if you want to have a balanced approach to thinking with one side of your brain and then the other. Pratik.
Thanks, Joi. Fantastic to be here. Thanks for rescuing me from all the other stuff that I'm doing to give you a wider lens on what really is important with ethics and AI. So I'm Pratik Shah. I am fundamentally trained as a biologist. I have a BSc PhD in microbiology, then worked at the Broad. And I may be one of the few biologists who's actually doing machine learning. I think I think it's probably fair to say that most machine learning people are doing health. But there are very few people who are trained fundamentally in biology are doing machine learning. So I happen to be in the reverse demographic. I'm fascinated by understanding complex systems and learning how things learn with human cognition, and that's why I became a biologist, because in biology there's a lot to understand, and we don't know how to put all that knowledge in context of what we know. So that's what attracted me to biology first when I was a child. And later on, I'm now very fascinated over the last 2 or 3 years to make machines become cognitive like us. And by that, I mean that there is machine saliency, and Joi might have mentioned, and there is human saliency. So when humans look at an object, they have a certain cognitive bias or evolutionary benefit to look at it and understand patterns, understand shapes. Machines are kind of something that we are training right now. And although they are kind of at a lower level of cognition than humans, if I may say, in some early systems, they have unique points of saliency. And some of those salient views that machines have or algorithms have can be exploited for medical knowledge. So my research program and what I'm really interested in one of the ideas that Joi and I have discussed, is to use machine saliency to find new medical information that humans may think it's not necessary or not useful. That's one. I'm also very passionate about looking at how learning systems can be applied at the point of care. So translating all the information we have in labs into point of care medical technology, making machine learning more accessible, deployable to help people at the bottom of the pyramid. Because I grew up in India, I come from a relatively middle class family, and I've seen both sides of the spectrum. So I'm very passionate about that. And the final is ethics, which Joi and I were discussing briefly yesterday, especially in healthcare and pharma, about how billions of dollars are being spent on potentially life-saving drugs. And we don't know what are human ethics there. We don't have a good idea about that. And when machine learning is introduced, I think we have an opportunity to introduce correct ethics in those learning systems.
Hi, I'm Vikash Mansinghka. I'm also delighted to be here. Thank you. I lead can you hear me in the back? Okay, thanks. I lead a group called the Probabilistic Computing Project. The questions that my group tries to answer are how can we build AI systems that go beyond pattern recognition, the kinds of sort of reflexive judgments that maybe the human organism can make in 100 or 200 milliseconds, and kind of move up to types of intelligence that might take a second or maybe minutes or in a couple cases hours of deliberation. So just to give 2 examples, an example of an inference that we make all the time, when we're driving, and we see somebody on the street, we can infer things like, are they likely to turn, to change direction, or does it seem like they're just going to go straight ahead? So that's an example of something that takes more than a couple hundred milliseconds, and in that way, it's actually not all that well suited for something like deep learning. But then, for an example, judgment call that takes hours. We did some work for the Gates Foundation, helping them by giving them an AI system that could make judgment calls about new data sets. So they get a new data set that represents a field study, and they want to know probably was the study done correctly or not? You know, are the predictive relationships between the variables what you'd expect to see if the field protocol was correctly followed? Or is there some bias based on the site that was being used to collect the data? Or does the outcome measure somehow not appear to be reflective of sort of the variables that were being manipulated? So those are judgment calls that a statistician might spend hours or more kind of sort of navigating. And we built an AI system that could help them do that. Sort of looking a little bit deeper, I would say actually I don't do machine learning. We really do AI research. So the way that so the distinction is machine learning has really shown in problems where there are objective right or wrong answers, where the cost of an error is small, and so where there's sort of ubiquitous data. And in all the problems I'm describing, actually none of those characteristics apply. There's some inherent ambiguity that the human organism needs to navigate to solve the problem, and that we need to give our computing systems the ability to deal with that kind of ambiguity and uncertainty. I would say that you know, another theme that the group has been looking at is how can we make AI technology that can deliver these capacities, but also be more accessible. So, you know, so that people with an IT background, or maybe even people who can just navigate a spreadsheet can make use of AI capabilities instead of having to just acquire a lot of technical expertise. As far as ethics, I would say there's sort of two places where I'm really inspired to be thinking about and working on the interface of AI and ethics right now. So the first one is pretty tactical, which is I think that although there's this kind of prevailing narrative that says, I think rightly, that there are some real risks posed by AI technology, I think there are also real opportunities to deploy AI technology in a way that helps, that's sort of in service of justice. And so, you know, with the help of people like Joi, we're involved in a nonprofit effort to get some early test cases of that going, to put open source AI technology in the hands of people working for the public good to help them make better, more empirically grounded arguments in service of justice. That's one example. And then long term, and this is something I really want to invite this group to think about, I think one of the deepest invitations that AI makes for people who are interested in ethics is to confront the question of what does it mean to have an ethics that's uncertain? So, you know, one of the drivers of the last maybe 10 or 15 years of progress in AI has been embracing probability and uncertainty, right? Moving away from computer systems that just have simple right or wrong answers to computer systems that consider ambiguous possibilities. And I think looking out, you know, 5, 10, 15 years, it would be, it's exciting to think that that way of thinking could get brought into work in ethics and moral philosophy, and maybe even policy and law, to start giving us a handle on ineffable, you know, questions that have been very hard to treat rigorously or carefully in the past.
And I might end up going backwards. Everybody start feeling free to jump in, but I want to click on one thing and then look at my philosophers a little bit, because I find, you know, what's interesting, I talked this morning a little bit about, in a playful way, about some of my friends who tend to believe that they can win at life, that they have basic parameters and they're optimizing.
Right.
But I think that most people tend to have a palette of ever-changing yearnings, that every day they have a different set of things they'd like to do, right? And I think there's a view that principled people, though, have some rules that they follow, and that they're organized, and that your values shouldn't change from day to day. And there's a somewhat random and stochastic nature of things, like meeting people serendipitously, or the thing that you ate that's changing your gut biome to make you feel a little bit more anxious and a little less friendly. And so there's all this stuff that happens in your daily life that is sort of probabilistic, and your earring was hitting the mic, so she's giving you something else. So I guess the question that I have is, one of the arguments against AIs that I have is that the current ones that we have, or let's call it machine learning, is that you sort of have to give it parameters for optimization, or create a game for it to win. But is there a way in probabilistic programming to be a little bit more like humans, where you know, a little bit more sophisticated than the random number generator, that the machine is constantly able to juggle a whole bunch of things and not over-optimize and create these horrible scenarios where, you know, you've solved the problem but destroyed the world. I mean, are you going to help us with making AIs more like people?
Yeah, okay, so I hope so, but let me borrow an example from Stuart Russell, who's the co-author of one of the leading AI textbooks. And for people who are interested in this, he gave a TED talk on this topic that I think is really worth seeing. So the scenario he posed in the TED talk was, imagine you program a robot in such a way that it has to follow your orders. And then you tell it, get me coffee. You may not realize that what you've done is you've given it permission to kill you and indeed kill all people in service of this goal, getting you the coffee. All right, so sort of Asimov's stories and the 3 laws of robotics were sort of one cut at these issues. But this is actually an engineering problem right now. That is, people who design the objective functions that these autonomous systems are trying to implement, well, the whole design methodology. I'm
going to toss you.
Yeah.
Sorry, bad toss.
So I'll just finish the story and then, you know, so this question of, is there an alternative, right? Like, can we somehow express a value or a preference which has characteristics that an objective function doesn't? It's defeasible, for example. So Stuart's point in this TED Talk is he says, the key principle is you have to make the robot not just try to do what you want, but be actively uncertain about what it is that you want. And be engaged in a process of inquiry about what you probably want, which might mean what it thinks you want, or it might mean something totally different. And it's that wiggle room where the robot is designed to be in a process of inquiry, formalized probabilistically, that prevents at least some of these extreme failure modes, like the robot killing you because it thinks that's the only way to get you the coffee you asked for.
And I'll hand it to you, but just it helps with the example that Jonathan Zittrain showed about the DAO, with this thing that got hacked, because the point about that is that you have a contract that will just march forward and pay out the hacker $50 million because it said it would, with a probabilistic programming thing where it's constantly questioning, wait, is this supposed to be what's going on? And you can interrogate it and say, actually, that's not what I meant, and that was just a bug. Whereas right now we don't have a way to do that. So that could be a solution for that sort of
Yeah, I mean,
error, right?
I would say that this programming methodology evolved partly out of attempts to reverse engineer the psyche. I mean, that's actually where my background came from. My lab's in the Brain and Cognitive Sciences department. And I think that perspective is maybe opens up new doors from an engineering perspective, and it creates all sorts of new kinds of room for error. Because now, you know, when you've written a probabilistic program and you try to get it to do something, I mean, some of the times it won't, and that's correct. So we're really in the earliest stages of understanding how to work with these tools, but I do think they point in a fundamental direction for resolving these problems and create a whole host of new ones.
You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah.
I'm Anna, so downstairs, a couple of floors down, Rosalind Picard has her effective computing laboratory, which is, of course, working on how to integrate emotions into computing. How do you think that probabilistic computing can kind of intersect with effective computing to make, an algorithm that's not going to kill you to get you your coffee?
Yeah, great question. So I guess say that there's 2 ways. So I actually spent yesterday all day with Intel with their anticipatory computing group, which is sort of, they're sort of resonant with some of the groups here at the Media Lab, like fluid interfaces and effective computing, where, that corner of Intel is trying to build computing systems that can know us a little bit better in very simple ways, like what are we trying to get the computer or the car to do, and maybe deeper ways, like how are we feeling while we do it. So certainly as a component technology, right, perceptions about a person's emotion are uncertain, right? I mean, even for me with my old friends, I may think I know what they're feeling, and sometimes I'm right, and sometimes I presume I'm right, and then we might get in a fight, right? So in that sense, probabilistic programming is really, one of the component technologies for building more effective computing systems. The other part I'll say is that on a longer time scale, again, like maybe more like 10 years, my hope is that this way of thinking will help psychologists, like actually there's Lisa Feldman Barrett in the Boston area at Northeastern, people who are trying to build theories of interoception. So, you know, what is happening when we interrogate our somatic experience or our own emotional experience, and really sort of asking the question, what is emotion? Or how can we build a sort of, can we develop a richer, more textured intellectual understanding of it? That I would say is in very early stages, but I'm also excited to see where that'll go over the next 10 years.
And I know I have a friend who had I think it was a pituitary, but it was an endocrine disorder, and so the doctor gave her different cocktails of hormones each day, with testosterone and other things, and she would inject them, and each time was a completely different personality, she said. And she didn't realize the extent to which the chemical balance defined who she was. And she picked the one that she liked the best, and now she shoots it every day, and that's the person she is, but she could always become another person. And what's interesting is that it's this weird loop, because your intent comes from your emotions, but if your intent can adjust your emotions, you have this very weird feedback system that becomes sort of too weirdly self-referential, right? And then the thing about affective computing, so there's a project that Roz does together with Centro Brazil, and what they're doing is they're measuring the affect of a child. And it also turns out that the robot body language, if, for instance, like adults always nod when you talk to them, children nod, I think, 30% of the time. And so if the robot nods 30% of the time, the child is more likely to trust the robot because it's a peer. And there's a bunch of things that robot body language can do to increase trust. And it also, if you take the affect, you can, and for education, you can say, okay, so you can tell by looking at the face whether they're challenged, bored, or just right. So instead of having to test them all the time, you can actually tune the learning. So, and then you can turn the body language so that they're more trusting, and then you model the child's brain to try to make sure that you're all great stuff if you're trying to teach a child good things. But if you imagine that suddenly affect is coming in, and you're able to manipulate people without going through their conscious filters, there are ethical challenges. And then, so that's one thing to sort of think about. And then the other thing, and I want to tie this a little bit to get you to talk a little bit more about your lensing. So, and you can just tell me if the way I'm describing this is wrong, but generally the way that machine learning currently works is you have a bunch of data, and you have an engineer who keeps fiddling with the knobs to try to get a high percentage accuracy on this other set of data to test the thing. And once it's done, it gets locked in and gets deployed, and then people say, oh, it worked 90% of the time. What Karthik's doing with human-in-the-loop machine learning is that actually human is in the training loop. So if you have the police officer, if you have the psychologist, and they look at the data and they say, oh, that's not what I would do, or that's not what I think, that actually changes the model, not just the assessment of the outcome, right? And so there's two pieces here for me is as we start to bring humans in the training loop, so if you make the interface such that the philosopher or the judge or the police person continuously makes the model better rather than just assesses the using of the data, I think that's an interesting thing. And then the piece on the affect stuff is if you're in a car and the Tesla is making everyone nervous, that should be data that informs the model, right? So every time you go around this curve, every Tesla is going to go the same way. And if everybody always gets stressed, it should update the model or it should learn something from that. And so I think sort of meta question is one is the way I describe human in the loop the right thing?
Yeah.
And can affect be one of the inputs, or should it be one of the inputs in the models, or are you working on that?
Great. So I would say human-in-the-loop machine learning is not a new idea. It's always been around since the 70s. There was one statistician called George Box who basically said, if you're going to do any Bayesian machine learning, it's very important for you to state the assumptions that you're encoding into your model, because all of us are working with assumptions all the time. Estimate the model, and then he says, instead of what we currently do in machine learning, which is model evaluation, and the twisting of the knob example that you gave, we basically sometimes describe that as superstitious twiddling of the knobs in the dark. because there's no principled way of configuring these parameters in a way to just get the desired output. And most of the time, the evaluation metric is one of classification, whether it's accurate or not. But in human-in-the-loop machine learning, we basically say model criticism is a question of you evaluating the assumptions that you made when you first started modeling the whole problem. And so the question of what evaluation function or discrepancy function you're going to choose has to come from you. When you involve the human in the loop, for example, the police officer or the cardiologist, whoever's doing the training, you very quickly understand that we've moved so far away in machine learning towards prediction, that I think sometimes we forget what we think is of value from the machine learning system might not be the same thing that is valued by the people who best understand the data. For the cardiologist who's just looking at angiograms, maybe not having an accurate presentation of an angiogram that's probably not the most important thing, because people can go and get the angiograms themselves. So I think that with human in the loop, it's not just a question of better machine learning models. It's a first principle look at the entire process. And actually, I think for us, just being a little more humble in how we approach the nature of the problem. With affect, and this is...
Because you were in that group too, right?
I come from the affective computing group. I got my PhD there. But I also have meditation practice from a very young age, and I just come from a different culture. And for me, one of the things I always grapple with is, I think many of the categories of emotions that people work on is maybe a little too reductionist. I don't like to describe any of what I'm feeling that way. And when you deal with things like what is the emotion in a child, etc., there are so many layers of things going on, from developmental psychology to what the kid ate. And it's just so intricately complex that I'm not very sure that a machine learning approach is probably how I would approach it.
And maybe move the mic to 3, 4 rows behind.
I'm not going to throw it.
You're not going to throw it? Okay, let's just pass it.
We should give it a try.
Thank you for passing it and not throwing it. That scared me. So Sarah Holland, assembler and Google Public Policy. And I have this question about humans in the feedback loop, and really specifically the end user. So to what extent should the end user be in the feedback loop, and in what context? And the question is really more about, is that collective accountability and influence? Is that representation, or is that garbage in, garbage out?
You say feedback. Can you define that a little bit more?
So feedback loop is in constantly saying, like, yes, this was right, no, this was wrong, and vice versa. So in my head, I think about like smart reply. So I liked that response, I didn't like that response. But more in terms of humans gauging the accuracy, and I put that term in air quotes, of what that means. So is that good in what context? Is that representative? Is that accountability, or is it kind of like sometimes with bad data, garbage in, garbage out?
Can I just add and tie that to another some related piece that came up at the end of Jay-Z's thing that Pratik can also work on, which is it ties to the explainability thing, right? So if you're a doctor and you don't understand the output, that's also an interesting feedback thing. And so one of the things that Jay-Z showed, Pratik, that you didn't see, was at the end he showed I think it was a paper in medicine, right? That showed machines predicting what was it? Was it death by cardiac arrest, by heart attack? But that there wasn't really any explanation for the relationship, or it was very complex. But you're also showing, and you can talk about this a little bit more, that maybe there actually is a theory or an understanding that could be derived, but not through our current framework, and that maybe listening and thinking about it. So there's the simple thing of just feedback, yes, no, but there's, I think, a much bigger one where suddenly the computer gives you a whole bunch of facts, that completely contradict any framework that you have, what is the response of the human being and the relationship with the computer? So there's sort of two, but it's really kind of when the machine and the human are interacting with.
Very quickly, can I make two other quick comments tying in what Vikash was saying, what you were saying? I think it's like machine learning or AI or whatever we are working on was invented by computer scientists who did math, and now we are expecting machines to behave like humans, while they were essentially derived from mathematical principles. And I am a huge fan of mathematical principles because it's math. But I think one of the things is that there are some other machine learning models which go from biologically inspired systems like the brain, the neocortex, and which make more lateral connections between neurons in an algorithm, is one way to kind of move towards more humanized way of looking at machine. That's one comment. And second is error in machine learning is highly penalized right now. It cannot be wrong. And in fact, if you look at all computer science publications, what is the area under the curve or your ROC curve of your algorithm, and that's the accuracy. While as humans, we are most likely, at least usually, wrong about many things. But we have this higher moral turpitude towards machine, and that goes to Joi's question. In healthcare, that seems to be incredibly important, that if you're diagnosing someone, you cannot make a mistake. And our entire healthcare system is set up with those paradigms, which I think are useful, should be enforced. And as Joi pointed out, there are many things that we are discovering in my research where the policy, we call it a policy, that an expert or a doctor uses to treat a patient is X. And when you use machine learning or we do reinforcement learning or advanced unsupervised learning techniques, it comes up with a complete new machine policy that we call, and it kind of defies, as Joi pointed out, what we understand about treating the disease. So, and I don't know the answer to that question, to be quite honest. I think more research is needed, and we need to kind of accept that machines can be wrong, but so could also we. And kind of come up with new paradigms of law, learning, ethics that can incorporate this back and forth between humans and machines to work together versus antagonizing each other.
And maybe you can tie it to lensing too, right?
Yeah, with the feedback loop question, one concrete example I can give is something that's been happening since the 1920s. We just don't take female cardiac symptoms as seriously as we probably should. And when you trace the whole thing, you realize, yes, women were not put in any cardiology trials till 1993, unless Congress had to step in and say, no, you have to put women, because they were, quote unquote, thought they were immune from heart disease because of their hormones, right? I think that when you use machine learning to unearth a very deeply embedded complex problem like this, which is a different way of looking at it than just, of course, it's garbage in, garbage out. The data is already only heavily oriented towards males, right? That becomes a little more interesting. So in the work that I'm doing, when I first went to Brigham, they were not too happy because they're probably wondering, who is this guy with a funny accent who thinks who can just barge into a cardiology lab? So there was no trust initially. But over a period of time, when you involve the doctor in the lensing loop and you basically show them why is it that only 20% of all cardiac investigations in North America are performed on women, though more women die? And the way they verbally express their symptoms or describe them to a doctor is also very different than how a man would describe it. You basically arrive at a point where you realize, oh my gosh, I just used lensing and machine learning to actually show them a fundamental bias, but the fix is not a predictive machine learning system that tells them when a female patient has heart disease. I think the fix is also pretty complex, like to your example of a complex self-adaptive system. Med school, internal medicine, cardiology, it's kind of drilled into you, look for atypical symptoms, look for atypical symptoms. You go to London and you see these big double-decker red buses. Person with a heart attack, usually like a guy with a suitcase, just going out of a hotel, just had a huge meal, just looks like he's having a heart attack, which is like this campaign to make people aware of how to recognize one. And I think the one they did for women was one where She calls 911, but she wants to clean the last pile of dust at home before opening the door when they come in. So the messaging is screwed up. It's like a complex, multi-layered problem. And no machine or no number of George boxes will actually solve that. And it's the feedback cycles are so crazy that it goes beyond garbage in, garbage out.
Maybe one up front, and then we're going to be starting to run out of time.
Hand-eye coordination. Hi, my name is Alana. I'm a high school senior from Washington, D.C. The question I have is more so related to what Professor Zittrain said at the end of his presentation about explainability and to what degree explainability, relates to the success of an algorithm. Because I know in the context of something benign like Netflix recommending your movie choices, maybe we don't need to know how all of the nuts and bolts work or what they are. But in the context of something more serious like parole decisions, deciding how long a person's prison sentence is, we would like to think that we can know what the variables are and how much weight is being given to them. So the question I have is, to what degree is explainability relating to the success of an algorithm? And also, do you have to sacrifice accuracy for transparency and explainability?
I think all three may have individual answers here. I'll give a fantastic question. I think Joi also mentioned the medicine. So the phenomenon of understanding of mechanisms is very prevalent in healthcare and clinics. So if you publish a paper in a high-impact medical journal like Nature, if you have a state-of-the-art machine learning algorithm that works at 90% accuracy, they would still say, show me the mechanism. So people have done the T-SNE plots and reverse engineering the neurons and seeing how they fire. And you are absolutely right in my opinion that a lot of time would be spent on making the algorithm explainable versus useful. And my personal opinion is, if I may say, that right now we should be trying to get accuracy and moving fast towards ethics and making them morally accountable for what we are doing versus trying to spend too much time on making them explainable. I think that's can go side by side.
And partially because I think medicine is just so crappy at understanding what's going on. I mean, I think, we really, anyway, I won't go for that.
No, you can say, I think I can complete your sentence. I think when people are trained in medical school or biology, people are trained with mechanisms, pathways, and understanding, and it's usually, sometimes it's over information. It's not required. Yeah.
So I had two comments. Davi, this is a fundamental question, and there are no simple answers. The first comment is, I'm not so sure there's an intrinsic trade-off between explainability and accuracy, but the lens I want to offer for that is how have we as a society developed mechanisms to help people build credibility in the solutions that they offer, right? So there's a whole dialogue that's only beginning to get started in machine learning, which it's sort of like for some of the people in the field who are maybe a couple generations my senior who are involved in starting machine learning, if you talk to them about it, like Tom Diederich, who organized a bunch of the Obama administration's events on AI, he will say, yeah, we were just so amazed that any of this stuff worked. We weren't worried about how to make it reliable or auditable. And now we're going, like people are adopting it like crazy. So there's a whole, so the angle I sort of want to offer is, kind of the academic mode of work in machine learning, or actually you see this in Silicon Valley too, where you're just sort of trying to get something to work and measure its accuracy. I think that's a big part of the problem. I mean, in other engineering disciplines, like if you talk to Ford about how they design some component system of a car, the way they think about what claims they can make about its fitness for purpose and its safety is just much richer and much more mature. They think a lot about all sorts of different ways it could go wrong. They don't reductively summarize its function or fitness for purpose in a single number. There's a whole dialogue around sort of, is this an appropriate, component technology to be bringing out there? And I think as we start thinking more that way about AI, rather than focusing on, to Joey's point, this one accuracy number, then we can start looking at different depths or kinds of explanation which are suitable to explain different sorts of errors, right? It's just like a very complex picture. And think that my hope is that kind of view, that broader view, will help us make progress. A second point I want to make, this is something I learned from Charles Nesson at the Berkman. He pointed out that in human decision making, actually sometimes the integrity of a decision making process depends on the right to not explain yourself. So when he said that, I was a little bit surprised at first. But then he said, well, think about a jury trial, right? The sort of sanctity of the jury to not have to explain why it decided something is a key safety valve that underpins the integrity of that process. Now, I don't think we should have AI processes that, I don't think we should have machines making decisions that carry that kind of moral weight anytime in the future. But I just want to point out that from a first principles perspective, I don't know whether explainability is always a virtue.
We have time for one more, and maybe we'll try to pick somebody who hasn't, or I guess both of you have already asked, so Kathy, or actually behind you, what's your name? Yeah, why don't we let you, so toss the...
Can I pass it to you?
Yeah. Here comes the mic.
Okay. Hello. Okay. So actually, it's not really a fully fleshed or thought out question, but it was more, so the jury parallel made me think a little bit, because I do think that there is a potential difference between taking sort of that kind of immunity from having to explain your decision because it's a person chosen amongst many, and so somehow we're not expecting that person to be able to explain fully their decision. But I think when you're talking about a machine or a very articulated system or a very intelligent person, or, you know, then I think maybe there are different considerations there, and you might have the right to claim more from that machine. So that's my thought.
Yeah, and I will add that one of the arguments that I've heard for juries is that you don't want them to be influenced by the political fallout of having to explain or having to verify what they say. And I'm sorry, I'm going to add one other thing. But also, if you think about a category of machine, which is just collecting the data, maybe the sentiment of a whole bunch of people, and being a machine that is a democracy, like one of Asimov's stories, then it doesn't actually know. It's like the Chinese room, right? It doesn't actually know what's going on in everyone's mind, but it is the machine that is aggregating what's going on in everybody's mind. So it would be the role of the judge that's managing the jury. So the different interesting layers of whether it's even explainable, but I don't know if you have a direct answer.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I really want to invite here, just, you know, riffing off of what both of you said, is that, I mean, I think that if we enlarge this question about, I think it's great that people are asking questions about pieces of software that are now, I'd argue, often inappropriately making decisions, and saying, what explanations do we have? To start asking, what are the explanations we already accept for the legitimacy of decisions in other social systems that we're embedded in, right? So, you know, a judge or a police officer or a prosecutor have forms of discretion they're allowed to exercise. Maybe that discretion's essential in some cases. Maybe it's also a place where various kinds of bias and abuse can be hidden. Much like, or in some ways, like how that would be the case if software were making an analogous decision. Or, you know, there are friends of mine that, you know, in the entrepreneurship world, where if I ask them for an explanation for something in the more commercial world, they'll say, well, the market decided it. Okay, well, what does that really mean, right? There are some discourses where that's a sufficient explanation. Right, and you know, so I think, I mean, I guess I hope that we will be led to think a little bit more precisely about what kinds of explanation we want in what circumstances and what purpose is the explanation supposed to serve, and also what cost does it impose to ask for one, and apply that more uniformly to both software and social systems.
And we're out of time, so thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Staying here? Okay, we're going to switch you out for some. Should we start? Okay, we're back. This is actually, interestingly, kind of leads on from a lot of the conversation. So maybe what we'll start out doing is sort of introduce yourself and your work, but also, I mean, you've been, I think the three of you have been here through the day, and so maybe if there are anything in the conversations that we've had so far that you want to add to, jump in, and then obviously for anybody out here, feel free to also wave your hand and jump in. But why don't we just kind of continue the conversation? But Kate, why don't you start out?
Sure. My name is Kade Crockford. I work at the ACLU here in Boston on technology issues mostly. I'm really interested in, I was just saying this to Joey, the first principles in ethics that Donella Meadows talked about. There seems to be a tendency in the policy world when we think about how to integrate algorithmic decision-making into tools like, or systems like the criminal justice system, there's a tendency to stay at the very surface level and to have a lot of fights there about what the algorithmic tool should look like and what types of data should be fed into it. And I think that has the impact of allowing us to continually avoid having a conversation at the much deeper level about the values and goals and paradigms. And I think that's really dangerous. So one of the things that I try to do in my work is encourage policymakers and technologists and people who are thinking in this space to avoid falling into that trap. I'll have a lot of other things to say, but that's all I want to say right
now. Good morning, afternoon, whatever. My name is Adam Foss. I just have one question for the audience, which will sort of like explain why I do the work that I do. Can you raise your hand if you identify as African American? So take a look around the room. And sorry, brothers and sisters, we're calling you out. Happy Black History Month. To Holly's point at the beginning, the reason that the work that I do is so important to me is we can have the smartest people in the room talking about these issues, but unless we have the people who are, like, the reason that they're not here is because they're being impacted by the system. If we don't have them in this room, then we're going to be in this whirlwind that we've been in. The other point that I wanted to pick up on was Kathy's. So what I do, I was a prosecutor in Boston for 10 years and just saw this cycle of the criminal justice system, the thing that we call the criminal justice system. As a prosecutor, we sit in this like very weird role where we don't really have any affinity towards anyone except for the people. We don't have an individual client. We certainly aren't making money for the decisions that we're making. So we are told to go and do justice, and we're fed a lot of stuff in school on how we're supposed to do that. But we don't actually learn tools how to do it. We don't have tools, like Kate was saying, how to do it. And so we have this really negative impact on people of color, people from marginalized populations, people who are frankly just different than the people who are running the criminal justice system. And so I created a curriculum as a prosecutor to teach other prosecutors things that we should have known before we ever had the ability to prosecute people, like what does it look like inside of a jail and prison? What actually happens in there, and what does it do to your stated end goal? What is trauma, and how does that play out in the lives of the people that are impacted by our system? How much does poverty drive the actions of the people who are coming in? And is this thing that was created hundreds and hundreds, we saw a nice image of all those white men back in the day creating a system that we still operate with right now, and is that, should we be asking ourselves, is that the best way to do it? And I took that curriculum, which was awesome and effective when it was implemented in prosecutors' offices all over the country. I took it to law schools, and their answer was, in rejecting the idea, that they're no longer trying to create public interest lawyers because we make bad donors. And so when we ask ourselves, what are these corporations that we call universities, how do we change them? I think that there is a greater strategy that has more to do with the reduction of profit in an educational institution and what those metrics look like than what we currently have. So those are the only two things I want to touch on this morning. I'm sure that we'll have a lot more to talk about, but I come at this from a lot of ways, but fundamentally, I brought Jordan. Jordan, raise your hand. Jordan's a junior in high school. I didn't step into this building until I was 36 years old. And as such, I never realized that I had a place here, so it was really important to me to bring someone who's 20 years my junior to the inside of MIT to see he has a place here too. So make sure you talk to Jordan today, because he's dope AF.
And I wanted to just click on one thing that you talk about a lot, but I think ties into this, which was you often tell a story about what happened to the people that you touched in one direction, sending them to prison or not, and that you had the choice, but that you don't have a system where the prosecutors have that feedback. You don't get that, right? So one of the things, and this is what we're doing in Chelsea and some other places, is now that we have data, isn't there an opportunity for prosecutors and others who affect people's lives to see what happens to those people? Because that seemed to be one of the things that you were saying, was that couldn't we do that?
Yeah.
And I think we can.
Yeah.
And it gets to Cade's point, which is we have to want to do that.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what you're working on. But maybe some of these tools that we're using to accurately throw people in prison can also accurately reflect back to the prosecutors what happens to the people that you throw in prison versus not, right?
Yeah, and that's the work that I'm doing here. I'm a director's fellow with the Media Lab, and the work that I'm doing here is more about understanding that culture change is going to require incentivizing behavior. And this is, again, why prosecutors are really interesting, because we don't really have an incentive to send people to prison, because we know at this point that it's really bad to our core objective.
There's a comment there. And maybe toss the mic over if somebody has.
Where's the microphone box?
Oh, there. But maybe for the video.
Thanks. Sorry, I didn't mean to stop the conversation. I just feel like it's not just about the opportunity, but also how do we start to change the narrative? So it's about an obligation, right? So because we can,
we ought to.
Maybe we should, and also we must. And so I'm just, want to keep challenging us to think even further beyond just maybe we should. It's how do we start to change the narrative to, if you can look at this in that way, you have to, there's no choice. So just tossing that out there.
There's another one, or you're just crab clawing. Okay.
DP.
Chris.
Hey everybody, I'm Chris Bavitz. I teach at HLS. I'm based at the Berkman Klein Center. I know a lot of you here because of the thing I do most of the time, which is run this law school clinical program, which is essentially a law firm with 5 or 6 lawyers and 30-ish students a semester that does legal work on both direct advising of clients, and that's why we've made ourselves available to folks who are in the assembly program, building technologies, bumping up against legal issues, that sort of thing, to come seek out our services. So we're here as a resource for you. We also do a lot of advocacy work, including with groups like the ACLU of Mass or nationally, or the EFF, or other sort of tech policy advocacy groups where we help them speak out on policy issues by engaging with administrative processes, filing amicus briefs, that sort of thing. I guess my relevance to this conversation is that I'm also heavily involved with one of our research work streams related to AI ethics and governance at Berkman, and that's specifically the one that we call sort of algorithms and justice, which has to date been primarily focused on the criminal justice system, although the way we've, I think, conceived of it and the way we've always framed it is that we're looking at the particular implications of the use of all of the kinds of technologies we're talking about here today, black box algorithms and machine learning and AI, by the government. So one key example we have here is criminal justice assessing, assigning a risk score to a criminal defendant before evaluating what her bail should be or making a parole decision or a sentencing decision. That's one of them, but I think you can even pull back from that a little bit and talk about, at a little bit of a higher level, what is the difference when a private company makes a choice to use one of these particular not so transparent technologies versus when the government chooses to use it. Ostensibly, Karthik mentioned the sort of or someone on the previous panel mentioned the kind of deference to the market, and there are lots of problems with that. But ostensibly, if I'm trying to choose among 3 different, social media sites I could use, and I have concerns about the way one of their algorithms delivers me information, but I like the other one, I guess I have a choice among those. Set aside antitrust issues and all of that. I don't have a choice when dealing with my government, when dealing with prosecutors, when dealing with my criminal justice system. So it is extra important that we get it right. And I guess I would say on the point that we were just talking about the ways to kind of flip the script on use of data, one thing I just want to kind of flag is I completely agree, and this is some of the work that we've been doing to say so much of the emphasis has been on taking people who are already partway through or all the way through the criminal justice system and saying, okay, what data do we have about them to predict outcomes? Are they going to come back for their court hearing in X number of months, or are they going to reoffend and that sort of thing? It is vitally important to think about using this data earlier on in the system. I will say that that has a lot of promise. It's also a little bit scary because it requires creating, possibly, and there are technological solutions to this, but possibly creating bundles of data and putting them in the hands of people that could use that data for good or for harm. And every once in a while, when I'm thinking about one of these great initiatives to use data and apply machine learning to kind of predict outcomes and intervene early in a diversion program or something like that, I picture sort of Kade looking over my shoulder and saying, well, wait a minute, the ACLU of Mass would have a lot of problems with the idea of all of these people talking to one another, sharing data, that sort of thing.
And that gets a little bit to the first video that I showed, which was a news clip that got the science wrong, right? So, and then I'm going to merge this with actually a health thing, which is, so for instance, we thought diabetes was one thing. It's actually multiple things that cause the same symptoms. Failure to appear is one of the things that our team is working on. And failure to appear is like a bit in it's either yes or no, right? But actually it could be because you have to take care of your parents, or it could be because you're an addict, or it could be something else. And the fact that for the criminal justice system it's just one thing is kind of like the medical system before we figured out that there were many causes to similar symptoms, right? So I think it's interesting that you can find underlying data now, and that can help you deal with the problem. But the other meta thing, which is kind of interesting, is, and I want to be a little bit careful about how I go into this, but for instance, in genomic research right now, are a lot of interesting things that we're learning about the relationship between genetics and various outcomes. And a lot of those results are being used by hate groups as science behind these things. And that's not even privacy stuff. It's just taking science and then kind of twisting it around and using it as a bad, like a bad version of it. And so one of the questions that I don't actually have the answer to, which is, I think that, and when we talk about regulation, you can regulate the research and you can regulate the deployment. But with bad media, which is what we have right now, you kind of also risk this weird thing, which is, because you also don't want to prohibit research too much, because one of the other things we did the year before last was the Forbidden Research Conference, and there's this very interesting thing. So we make it very difficult to do research on pedophilia and on things like sex robots, but they're coming. But we don't yet know, for instance, scientifically, whether giving somebody who has a problem with pedophilia a sex robot or a VR, we don't know if it actually can make them better or makes it worse. And if we don't know that scientifically, it's very hard to come up with the right policies. So the inhibition of research is also really dangerous. And so to your point, it's kind of an area that's very fraught with both opportunity and risk. But change isn't going to wait for us to figure this out, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting examples of that is the study that, I forget who it was, somebody did a study recently showing that allegedly there's a gay face, right? You guys are familiar with that? I think I probably have it. I hope I have it. In any case, there's a gay face, so wow, that's scary maybe if Jeff Sessions is, in control of the database of all the faces, right? But that gets to the question of, I was thinking the exact same thing, right? Prosecutors don't only have the option to do this, they have an obligation to actually understand what they're doing and the impact of their work. On the other hand, when I saw Zittrain's slide about what Bono said, I thought to myself, so if I can punch Bono in the face, does that mean I should do it? Right? And I find him to be unbelievably irritating, so I probably would if I had the opportunity. But anyway, the point is, I don't think in many cases we actually should do things that we can do, right? So there are a lot of examples of that in the work that I do. So gay face is maybe one of them. The others, though, are things like, the creation of these enormous databases that law enforcement is amassing, not just at the federal level, but at the city level as well now. Where they're collecting huge quantities of information about everyone, conducting mass surveillance using license plate readers, soon, facial recognition systems that are built into the ubiquitous CCTV that we have all over cities now that are, interlinked and, networked cameras that can be operated from a single hub. These are things that we shouldn't do, actually. We certainly can, and they are likely going to happen, but they're really bad ideas. And there's a really ugly area of the law. I was also thinking about Lessig's formulation of the four, sort of pressures that create the world that we live in, and they influence one another, right? I mean, my colleague Jay Stanley at the National ACLU gives this example all the time. It's really interesting. People don't necessarily think about how technology and the law interact in ways that are maybe unexpected. So one example is that the Wiretap Act, when it was passed in the 20th century, had the impact of determining what CCTV, the whole industry, would look like. And why? Because you can't have audio recording, right? So that's a really weird interaction that I think the people who wrote the Wiretap Act could not have predicted. And I'm really concerned sort of similarly about the interaction between really, really, really bad historical law that we have precedent, Supreme Court precedent, around, for example, a Terry stop. Do you guys know what that is? It's a Supreme Court ruling that says that law enforcement basically can pat you down and force you to empty your pockets when they stop you on the street if they have what's called reasonable articulable suspicion that you may have a weapon on you. And this is a really frightening thing in combination with the kinds of databases and mass surveillance that I've described. I'm envisioning a future, if we don't get it right and make some interventions along the way, where law enforcement officials have contact lenses that have facial recognition built into them. They're walking down the street scanning every person they see. A database system, working with some algorithms is telling them, effectively coloring maybe, even in their field of vision, every person they see as yellow, green, or red. And that designation itself, whether or not the data it's based upon is even accurate, determines reasonable suspicion, right? I saw you, my computer system colored you as red, so I stopped you. Courts may very well think that's totally appropriate. And given historical precedent, I think that's actually likely. So I'm really worried about those areas where the law and technology are going to interact in ways that I think people are not worried enough about, frankly.
And it is a real world sort of like example of how we're already there in this really scary way. There was a school fight between two school-aged children in Boston last week, in East Boston High School, that was described as a non-violent fight. I don't know what that is. But it was a non-violent fight. But the students' names...
I think it's called an argument.
Yes.
Yeah.
An argument in the cafeteria where the students' names were put into the school database that went to the school police database, that went to the Boston Regional Intelligence Center database, which highlighted one of these young people as a gang member, which alerted the federal government, which alerted them that he was also undocumented. And so instead of the principal dealing with this situation, ICE dealt with the situation.
You've been tweeting about this a lot, right?
Yeah, this is an issue that we're trying to grapple with at the ACLU for sure. And, you know, there are multiple places along the way where people maybe didn't make decisions, right? Simply just allowed things to happen in a way that was really not very thoughtful. And I guess that more than anything is what concerns me, is that we'll sort of just keep plodding, you know, along in the same direction that we've been plodding. And increasingly, technology makes the direction we're heading in worse and worse and worse, right? Whether it's with respect to economic inequality or racial injustice in the criminal justice system, or any number of other serious crises that we face as a society, technology just exacerbates those really, really quickly.
Well, and I think that's why DACA is really important, because if you're not a citizen, you don't have the same rights, right? And like this case of the traumatized, victimized ex-girlfriend of a gang member's new boyfriend being undocumented, ending up on this list. It's just this kind of horrible mess that we have, and there are a couple of questions. So I think there's in the back, and then I'm going to go first for people who haven't said anything. So can you go? Oh, well, I can go there. Yeah, go ahead, and then we'll go back.
Just a question about what you just referred to. So, you know, there's this horrible thing that happens, and these systems reveal themselves of like automated injustice. How do we know about those systems beforehand? Like, how do we have a descriptive or are able to have a discourse about these are the systems that are deployed and you should be aware of it before these kind of individual tragedies happen? Because they seem so hard to access or kind of reveal until there's a victim, which seems like crazy.
I really want to hear what you guys have to say on that. What I'll say from like a very cynical point is that that story is one that will always be sort of trumped, by the use of the BRIC, the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, by the detectives and all these folks, MBTA, EMS, who will say, we need to hang on to the BRIC because we've been able to make all these successful arrests of all these violent people, and you're not going to be able to find me, even the most woke, white, progressive, wealthy, liberal in Massachusetts, who says, get rid of the BRIC because this one kid went away because all these other bad brown people were prosecuted and incarcerated.
I mean, I have a different take, which is that we can to some degree, I think, future-proof processes, not necessarily, right? So one really interesting area that the ACLU has been working in lately, that we are engaged in both here in Cambridge and in the city of Boston, is trying to get officials to pass municipal laws that require the police to go before the city council before they want to adopt new surveillance technologies. So typically the way that this works, I mean, historically the answer to your question would be, that's my job. It's to try to figure out what they don't want us to know and to tell everyone. And then you're right, after the fact, we play catch up, right? And try to regulate, outlaw certain things, whatever. This idea is to sort of invert that so that we have an opportunity at the outset, before the technologies or the database systems or the information sharing agreements have been formalized or acquired, and have a public debate about A, whether or not it's a good idea to buy the license plate readers, B, if we agree as a city that, yeah, we should have them, then we decide how they're going to be used, right? How the information will be stored, how long it will be retained, who it can be shared with, you know, under no circumstances will ICE ever be able to get a hold of it, that sort of thing. And I like the establishment of processes as opposed to thinking about discrete technologies, because it allows us to, like I said, future-proof, you know, these problems.
How do you then also build into that? If we meet this benchmark where we see this disparity, then we reconvene and we talk about the technology as a whole.
Reporting, yeah. So, you know, built into these ordinances also is a requirement that the police report back to the council, you know, on an annual or semi-annual basis about how the technology was used, racial disparities in the use of the technology, those types of things, so that we can continue to reassess.
Yeah, reinforcing everything that Kade said, in the process of doing this work on government use of these kinds of tools, we've kind of left the realm of the really interesting, sexy Minority Report robotic judges, and we've landed squarely in procurement, which is actually
Yeah.
really interesting and important. But
Yeah.
we've kind of mapped this cycle where outside private developers develop technology, government organizations decide we need to procure a piece of technology, and they go out and get one. Then that technology is deployed for a particular reason, and on the back end, to Kate's point that they were just making, the technology needs to be tested and evaluated. And we see so many failings along the way as we look at these kinds of technologies in that cycle where technology is being procured for purpose A, say it's a scoring tool that's being used to assess bail and determines that your risk score is 4 and your risk score is 6, and someone along the way decides, well, let's use these risk scores for a purpose other than bail as well. So set aside whether it was appropriate for bail in the first place, now it's being used for sentencing or parole or for something like that. That's a really bad fit. At the implementation phase, we have judges who are using these kinds of technologies who don't fully understand that there's a 6-factor test they need to apply to make a particular determination, and this technology is answering questions 1, 2, and 3, and they now step in and answer questions 3, 4, 5, and 6, thus having double counted factor 3, right? So we need really rigid implementation guidelines for the people who are actually applying these things. And again, it doesn't seem like the most interesting topic in the world, but I think procurement and then use in government, there's a lot of room for people in this room to be promulgating best practices, to be evaluating technology. Finally, to the last point about the testing and evaluation, there is a trend when it comes to government procurement of technology more so than anyone else toward inertia, where we've all been at the DMV and looked over the shoulder of the person who's looking at some amber screen from 30, 40 years ago. That's the system they bought 30, 40 years ago, maybe thinking we'll reevaluate that at some point and make it better. That doesn't happen when government buys technology so often. So I think more so than ever before with these kinds of tools, we need to be thinking about short cycles. Let's put this in place. Let's put it in place for a short time. Let's make the data widely available and let the researchers see what happens.
And just 2 short things. So I do think that local governments function as better democracies than federal, and so I do think that locals really, and San Antonio and other places are doing a really good job. And I do think procurement's important because you kind of follow the money, right? And so right now, a lot of these vendors are still haven't gotten to the size of corruption capability, but they will. So you kind of want to cut it off before they get that. The problem is the federal government buys things like the DHS FAST system to deal with terrorist filtering in people inbound into the country, but that's dual purpose. So you could easily see that go first to ICE and then next to things like the criminal justice system. So I think what's really important is to look at the business side too and look at where the capabilities are being developed and to try to head off what happens with voting machines in other places where you get a sufficient market to where now the eradication isn't about just convincing city council. You have to kind of dig into sort of the whole Lessig thing, which is the corruption part. There's one question back there, and then we'll come back up here. Can you raise your hand again, and then I don't know if you want to throw it or hand it back.
Where is it? All right. I will try and throw this, but I'm very bad at basketball.
There you go.
Thank you. I'm perhaps looking for a silver lining here, but I'm wondering if there's like an intrinsic tension between like data as it relates to like the legibility project of the state and individual liberty, or on the flip side, there is some possibility for a new role of like an advocacy for data scientists, where they might partner with communities and understand that data and models are not neutral, but actually are intrinsically biased, and it's up to sort of the data scientist to choose where that bias is going to fall. And if you've seen examples of that in practice.
Yeah, definitely. So the Ford Foundation has been funding over the past 4 or so years technology fellowships in organizations like the ACLU for the express purpose of creating a new career path for folks who come out of places like MIT. And there's a really interesting history there, actually. I didn't know this until I got involved with this technology fellows program that Ford was running. But Ford was actually instrumental in the creation of a public interest legal career track as well, like 50 years ago, when at that time, you went to law school, you were either going to work for a private corporation or you were going to be a prosecutor. Basically, there was like nothing really else. And organizations like the ACLU had existed, or rather just the ACLU existed. There weren't really other groups like it for many years. And it was a really deliberate process to create, funding opportunities for lawyers to work at organizations dealing with issues around climate and human rights and things like that. And the exact same thing is happening right now with respect to technologists in civil service type work. So that's, I think, really exciting and totally important.
And I would like, as a person who spent most of my time working with young people in the criminal justice system, I have this like weird line that I straddle. When I see the graphic about Facebook has this data set that says this person is about to get in a relationship, working with young people in the criminal justice system, I would imagine that there is a similar graphic that looks like a gang crime is about to happen, a violent gang crime is about to happen. How do we capture that data and use it in a way that addresses the needs of the kids who are literally like, we're telling you this out loud because we're kids and something bad's going to happen. If you don't do something, I'm going to complete this act. Like a kid who runs into a fight in school and he's like, please somebody catch me before I actually have to throw a punch. How do we do that and treat the child as opposed to use that information to predictively go out and police that kid, search their house or whatever? I would love to see a way that we straddle those two lines, accomplishing the goal that we want to accomplish, which is protecting the safety of that young person and other young people around them without going to that state where Cade is freaking out.
Okay, sorry, there's what you there.
Joi, you were pushing for kind of paradigmic change in the last talk. Yeah. I was just curious if for each of our speakers, if you support the idea that we should look at things that way, or if it's too big. If you do agree, what do you think a paradigm change would look like? And if it helps as an example, like talking about ownership of data versus a rights-based approach to data as kind of something that would have a knock-on effect throughout the system.
I don't understand the last point of your question. That's because I'm not that bright. But when I saw Joey's list of things, I see people doing criminal justice reform work at step 12. Let's change the laws, let's change the policies, let's change the, let's push on the things that say these are the things that we have to do. Where I came into building my organization, I was like, let me start with paradigm shift. Because I don't care if it's a risk assessment tool, or it's a new piece of legislation, or something that's been repealed, or a new policy that's been issued by a prosecutor. If you don't change the paradigm by which those people are coming into the job, and the thing that they want to do is actually the thing that we're told, which is fairness and justice and safety and all these things. If you don't change the paradigm of what those things are, I will use the risk assessment tool to find a way to continue to do the thing that I do right now. If you reduce minimum mandatory sentence, if you repeal minimum mandatory sentences for a drug crime, instead of charging a person with 1 count of possession with intent to distribute crack cocaine, I will now count every rock in that bag and charge you with each one of those rocks, thereby end-arounding your repealing of that minimum mandatory sentence in a way. We will always find a way as people in the system. We talk about the criminal justice system, prison, all these things as if they're entities that are driving behavior, and it's actually the other way around. We, as the people who are in it, are driving the outcomes and the efficacies of those institutions. And so if we can, and again, this is why I like really heavily double down and focus on prosecutors, if we can change that paradigm, which is more about giving tools and empathy and understanding than it is trying to shift the entire incentive structure, then I think we can turn this around.
I agree with all of that. I will say that I sometimes worry about my own work that we're doing is not focused enough on the paradigm shift piece of this, and that we're tinkering at the margins. And I was in a conversation recently with a group of people about autonomous weapons that I think drives this home, where you could, let's say hypothetically that we could come up with a drone that could make more precise determinations than any human being ever could about targeting the people that it intends to target and avoiding collateral damage to the people and the things and property that it doesn't intend to target. I think applying a traditional paradigm around rules of war, you might actually say that's great. You've created an even more efficient tool of a weapon or tool of destruction, and you've avoided asking the really big picture question, which is, geez, do we even want machines at all remotely involved in this process for some of the higher level moral reasons that I think Gabe was alluding to at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, the paradigm that I would like to see shift is, I think, even more radical than that. It's, especially with respect to the criminal legal system, let's not actually invest in it at all. Let's invest in other things, right? So people, a good example of this problem is what's been happening in Massachusetts with criminal justice reform. There's this omnibus criminal justice reform package that's now being worked out in a conference committee between the House and the Senate here. And risk assessment tools are a piece of that. The reason that somebody wanted to bring risk assessment tools into this CJ package is because there was a court ruling at the Mass High Court a couple years ago holding that you can't basically, the Massachusetts bail statute doesn't allow for judges to hold people because they can't afford to pay to get out of jail or to stay out of jail. That it's unconstitutional is a finding that some courts in other parts of the country have held. This is like a traveling lawsuit that some advocates are doing. And the response to that, instead of saying, 70% of people in Massachusetts jails are there pre-trial, and a lot of them are there because they're poor, maybe we should figure out just an entirely different way of thinking about this problem, which would start actually before the prosecution. It would start before the arrest even. Are you poor? Is that why you're stealing something? Do you have a drug problem? Is that why you've been arrested for selling drugs? Maybe we should deal with that problem instead of investing more resources in the criminal punishment system. We don't really want to do that as a society. Those are, questions that we're frankly loath to address. And so instead, policymakers, like you were saying, Adam, go to this really number 12 level conversation of, well, maybe we should introduce a tool. And I think, the danger there, I used to get asked a couple years ago when predictive policing was a really hot topic in the press because it was starting to bubble up in some cities. What do you think at the ACLU about predictive policing? And I would always say things that I think really irritated the journalists because I kind of refused to answer the question. I would say I don't care. We shouldn't be doing this. We should stop giving the police resources when other departments and entities in government really need them, right? And a great example of this, some really interesting work that some of my colleagues are doing in New Jersey is, just think about it this way. If there's a health crisis or, a crime or a mental health issue, this happened in Boston a few years ago. There was a young black man who was really having a mental health breakdown, and he was sitting on his front stoop in the South End and wouldn't get up, and his mother didn't really know what to do. Who could she call? I mean, there's no one to call besides the police, right? There's no one to call in our society who will show up, who's paid by the government other than the cops. And she said on the phone with 911, please don't send the police. He has a negative reaction to people in uniform. He's not going to react well if the police come. And guess what happened? The police came and they killed him because he, had a negative reaction, just as his mother warned them that he would. But we have no other way of dealing with that, right? I mean, the police are our response to everything as a society, everything that goes wrong. Fundamentally. So yeah, my colleagues in New Jersey are looking at a paradigm shift that I think is really exciting and kind of tacks with the abolition movement, which is to create a municipal response team, basically, that is composed of mental health workers and caseworkers and people who can help people in crisis when, handcuffs and chains is really not what anybody needs, not what the person who's in crisis needs, and certainly not what our society needs either.
And we're out of time, but I want to just end with maybe pushing it back to the class, which is, Harvard has more Supreme Court justices that you guys have come out of your place. The inventor of libertarianism came out of MIT. And so, we have people who come out of our institutions that do reframe things. And questions like, should we redesign the criminal justice system? Should we retrain prosecutors differently, Harvard still thinks about money, but it's part of their job to sort of, at least for some of them, to ask those really hard questions and these sort of first principle things. And so I think it's the duty of the students like you who care about this, who are equipped with the credentials and the access to speak up and think these thoughts. And I think that's the point of this class, is to understand the mechanics so that you understand all the second order effects, but also to go up to the first principles. And we have people who are also connected to the ground. And I think it's to be honest, that the Donella Meadows layers, I think all of those layers have to happen, and they all have to be coordinated. You can't just do one, but you have to also be able to go all the way up to the top, and I think that's kind of our job.
I think it just goes to the graphic that you showed of all the founding fathers, and this is where sort of we are always in tension and conflict. It's, do we just blow this thing up and build another system, which is, I mean, fundamentally.
That's what's trying to happen right now,
It's
kind
the
of.
answer. But then you have to recognize that that doesn't look much different than it does now in the people who are making these decisions. And so how do you get them to the place where we're at a tipping point where we're not exactly at abolition, but we're opening their minds to there's something so much greater that can have benefits to you, and it doesn't mean that you're doing a bad thing.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, guys.